The tear didn't look like anything in particular. That was the first wrong thing about it. Whis noticed it before anyone else did, the way he noticed most things. A half-second early, filed away with the same mild interest he gave to a change in the wind. He was standing beside Beerus, on the observation platform above the Null Realm, waiting for the Tournament of Powers opening ceremonies to finish their tedious pageantry, when a thread of wrongness unspooled itself across the lower edge of his vision. Not a color, not quite a shape. Just a place where the fabric of the world had, very briefly, forgotten how to be fabric. Whis. Beerus didn't open his eyes. He rarely needed to. Yes, Lord Beerus. I saw it too. What was it? Whis considered the question with the same care he gave to considering a wine's vintage. I'm not entirely sure. Which is, in itself, somewhat concerning. That got Beerus's eyes open. 400 kilometers below, in the churning null space between the arena platforms, space that technically didn't exist until Zen-Oh's power carved it into being for the tournament. Two shapes fell out of nothing and hit the ground like they'd always belonged there. The first was a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit. He landed on his feet, absorbed the fall the way a person absorbs stepping off a curb, and looked around with the vague, faintly put-upon expression of someone who'd been expecting a bus and gotten a taxi instead. Huh, Saitama said, to no one. Guess that wasn't Mars. Behind him, a second shape unfolded out of a settling drift of red mist and shadow that had no business existing in a universe with a sun that clean. Alucard rose to his full height without seeming to have fallen at all, dusted off sleeves that weren't dusty, and surveyed the alien sky above him with the slow, patient attention of a predator, confirming which continent it had woken up on. How curious, he said, and smiled with too many teeth for the sentence to be friendly. Neither of them knew where they were. Neither of them, notably, seemed bothered by that fact. Saitama had been midway through a grocery run. Cabbage was on sale, and he'd had a coupon he refused to let expire, when the world had simply stopped being there. No warning. No monster of the week rupturing space with some cosmic horror gimmick. One second he was reaching for a discounted head of cabbage. The next he was falling through a gray nothing that smelled faintly like ozone and static. And then he was standing on strange ground under a stranger sky. His first thought had been, this is annoying. His second thought, upon noticing the coupon was still crumpled in his fist, had been, at least I kept this. Alucard's arrival had been considerably less mundane, in the sense that he had, in fact, noticed the tear coming. He simply hadn't cared enough to avoid it. He'd been standing in the ruins of a manor that no longer existed, in a country that would take him decades to properly haunt again, indulging the specific, ancient boredom of a creature who had run out of things capable of killing him. When the rift opened in the air in front of him like a wound that hadn't decided what shape to bleed into, he had regarded it the way a man regards an unexpected knock at the door, mildly intrigued, entirely unafraid, and stepped through it, because it was, at minimum, new. Now he stood on alien ground beside a very ordinary-looking man in a jumpsuit, under a sky the wrong shade of violet, in air that tasted faintly of a power he did not recognize and, more unsettlingly, that did not seem to recognize him. You're not from around here, Saitama said. It wasn't a question. It was the tone of a man confirming a fact he'd already accepted 3 seconds ago and moved past. Astute, Alucard said. Neither, I gather, are you. Yeah, I was gonna buy cabbage. Saitama looked down at the crushed coupon in his hand, sighed, and pocketed it anyway. Waste not. Above them, far above, on a platform that hung in space like it had been carved rather than built, 100 small figures had stopped moving entirely. The Tournament of Powers opening ceremony had exactly one job left to finish. Zen-Oh's traditional blessing over the arena, delivered with the same cheerful indifference he gave to everything, followed by the drop of the barrier that would seal all 12 universes' champions into their shared battlefield until only one remained standing. The blessing did not finish. Zen-Oh, both of him, the future and the present sharing a floating dais with matching bored delight, had gone very still, not frightened. Zen-Oh did not experience fear in any framework a mortal could recognize. But still, in the specific way a machine goes still, when it encounters an input it has no category for. Huh, future Zen-Oh said. Huh, present Zen-Oh agreed. Every god of destruction on the platform felt it at the same moment their king did. A ripple through the substrate of the Null Realm's improvised existence, small and localized and utterly without precedent. Beerus's tail had gone rigid before he consciously registered why. Whis, he said again, quieter this time. Sense them. Whis extended his awareness the way he might extend a hand to test bathwater, and found, for the first time in longer than he cared to calculate, nothing. Not nothing as in absence, nothing as in a hole cut clean out of the readable world, two shapes on the ground below that his perception simply slid off of, the way water slides off a stone that has been oiled. I can't read them, Whis said. His voice hadn't changed pitch, but something in it had sharpened. Not their power level, not their key signature, not even, Lord Beerus, I can't confirm they're alive in any sense my senses are built to recognize. It isn't that the number is high, it's that there is no number to find. Beerus turned his head very slowly toward the edge of the platform, toward the two small figures standing in the churn of not quite space 400 kilometers below, one of whom was, at that exact moment, absently checking his pockets for anything else he might have lost in transit. That, Beerus said, is a genuinely new sentence for you to say to me. I don't enjoy it. Word moved fast in a multiverse built for tournaments. Toppo felt it first among the Pride Troopers, a justice-tuned instinct honed over decades of policing Universe 11's worst impulses telling him, with total conviction and zero supporting data, that something had entered the arena that did not belong to any category his training covered. He said as much to Jiren, who received the information with his usual stillness and simply turned his head toward the source, the way a mountain might turn to face weather. Dispo was already moving before Toppo finished the sentence, streaking toward the platform's edge, in a blur that would have registered as instantaneous to any mortal eye, and as merely fast to the beings now watching from above. Report, Toppo called after him. Reporting requires me to see something first, big guy, Dispo called back, and vanished over the rim. What he found, when he arrived, did not resolve into anything his considerable experience had prepared him for. A bald human, objectively, laughably unremarkable, no visible musculature worth commenting on, no aura, no stance that suggested trained combat readiness, was crouched by a small crack in the null space floor, prodding at it with mild curiosity, as though checking whether a puddle was deep enough to be worth stepping around. Huh, didn't do that on purpose, the man said, to the crack. Several meters away, a pale figure in an absurdly long coat was studying the sky with the unbothered patience of a tourist, deciding whether the view was worth photographing. When Dispo's arrival displaced the air hard enough to kick dust into a small localized storm, the figure's head turned, not fast, not slow, just precisely, and a pair of eyes the color of old blood found him immediately, as if they'd known exactly where to look before Dispo had finished landing. A new attraction, Alucard said, sounding genuinely delighted for the first time since arriving. How considerate of this place. Dispo did not immediately move to attack. Pride Troopers did not brawl first and assess later. That was Toppo's whole doctrine, drilled into every member of Universe 11's roster since their earliest training. Assess, classify, Then act with justice as the compass, not instinct. So Dispo assessed, and found, to his considerable and immediate discomfort, that he could not. "Who are you?" he said, not what. His instincts at least were smart enough to start with the polite version. "And how'd you get inside a sealed tournament dimension? Nobody just walks in here." "We fell," Saitama said, straightening up from the crack in the floor. "Not really our call. You know anywhere around here that sells cabbage?" Dispo stared at him. "Cabbage," he repeated. "Or literally any vegetable. I had a coupon." There was a beat of silence in which Dispo tried, and failed, to locate a joke in the statement, before deciding, correctly, that the man meant it with complete sincerity, and that this fact was somehow more alarming than if he'd been lying. By the time Toppo himself arrived, along with 3 other Pride troopers dispatched at Jiren's silent nod, the scene had not escalated. This, more than anything, was what troubled Toppo most. He had walked into enough first contact scenarios across enough tournament cycles to know the shape of them. A threat postures, a threat gets assessed, a threat either stands down or gets contained. What he found instead was a man in yellow idly stretching, apparently bored, and a second figure watching the growing crowd of Pride troopers with the specific, patient interest of a man deciding which wine to order. "You will identify yourselves," Toppo said, in the booming register he reserved for moments requiring the full moral weight of Universe 11 behind them. "This is a sealed contest space, sanctioned by the Omni King himself. Your presence here is either an accident that will be corrected, or an intrusion that will be answered." Alucard's smile widened, unhurried. "An intrusion. I do like the sound of that word, coming from someone who so clearly believes he could enforce it. Believe isn't the operative word." "No," Alucard agreed. "I imagine it rarely is, for men who've never lost." Something in the way he said it, utterly without heat, utterly without doubt, made even Jiren, watching from a distance with his arms folded and his expression unreadable, feel the smallest, most unfamiliar flicker of something he did not often permit himself to feel, toward an unknown quantity. Curiosity edged with caution. Toppo raised a hand, signaling his troopers to hold position rather than close in, a decision that, later, several of them would privately credit with saving their lives, though none of them yet understood why. "Then let's establish something simple first," Toppo said. "Power. Show me what you are, and I'll decide what happens next." Saitama, who had been listening to all of this with the mounting impatience of a man stuck in a long checkout line, finally spoke up. "Look, I don't really want to fight anybody today. Can somebody just point me toward an exit, or a store, or literally anything with normal produce in it?" "There is no exit," Toppo said, "not until the Tournament of Power concludes." Saitama's face did the thing it did whenever the universe failed to be interesting in a way he could work with. A flattening, a small internal sigh made visible. Tournament of what now? It was Dispo, still faintly rattled from his earlier attempt to read the man's power, who explained it in clipped, rapid bursts. The Omni King, the 12 universes, the stakes of erasure hanging over every combatant's home reality. The fact that this platform existed specifically to host a battle royale whose losing universes would, without exaggeration, cease to exist. He watched the bald man's face carefully as he said it, half expecting fear, half expecting the particular stillness of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about the situation they'd fallen into. Saitama just frowned. "So if I don't fight, does my universe get erased or something?" "'Cause I didn't sign up for a tournament. I fell into this by accident." "That's..." Dispo hesitated. He genuinely didn't know. Nobody had ever fallen into a sealed tournament space uninvited before. There was no ruling on it. "That's not clear." "Great," Saitama muttered. "Love that for me." Alucard, meanwhile, had not stopped watching Toppo, and there was something in his patience now that had shifted register entirely. Less amusement, more the specific attention of a very old creature recognizing, for the first time in a long while, a room he did not yet fully understand the rules of. He found that he liked it. It had been decades since a room had managed that. Justice, Alucard said, tasting the word Topo had wielded like a banner. An interesting organizing principle for beings who can erase entire worlds on a whim and call it order. Tell me, does your justice extend to the multiverse's own architecture? Or only downward, onto those smaller than the ones who built the cage? Topo's jaw tightened. The Omni King's authority isn't cruelty, it's balance. Alucard's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes did, briefly, sharpen into real attention. We'll see how that word holds up. High above, on the observation platform, Beerus had watched the entire exchange in silence, tail flicking with the particular agitation of a cat, presented with a closed box it very much wanted opened, and very much did not trust. Whis. Yes, Lord Beerus. I want to know what they are before this tournament starts, not after. Before. That may prove difficult. As I said, my senses find nothing to measure. It isn't that their power is hidden. It's that whatever they are may not run on power in the sense we understand it at all. Beerus's eyes narrowed toward the two distant figures below, one apparently arguing with a pride trooper about vegetables, the other watching Topo with the unmistakable, ancient patience of something deciding whether a species was worth its attention. Beerus had destroyed planets on instinct for less unsettling reasons than the itch currently crawling up the back of his neck. Get Zen-Oh's attention, he said finally, quietly. I don't want to panic. I want answers. And if there are none to be had, Beerus's tail lashed once, sharp and final. Then we make some. Down on the null space floor, the standoff had reached the particular equilibrium that precedes every real story's first true spark. Not yet violence, not yet alliance. Just two impossible things, and an entire multiverse's worth of power structures, quietly recalculating what impossible was even supposed to mean anymore. Saitama, having given up on finding vegetables through diplomacy, sat down cross-legged on the null space floor, with the resigned patience of a man settling in for a long wait. So, he said, to nobody in particular, anybody got food that isn't like cosmic, just regular food? I could go for ramen. Alucard laughed, a low, genuine sound that startled every pride trooper within earshot, because it held none of the menace they'd braced for, and somehow that was worse. I have missed, he said, mostly to himself, meeting something the world hasn't already told me how to categorize. Above them, unnoticed by everyone but Whis, the crack Saitama had idly prodded earlier in the null space floor had not fully closed. It sat there, thin and patient, a hairline seam in the fabric of a dimension built to be sealed, the first small proof that something had entered the tournament of power that the rules had never been written to contain. The blessing never finished. The barrier never dropped on schedule. And somewhere in the space between 12 universes worth of gods, deciding what to do about two beings their own cosmology couldn't measure, the tournament of power quietly, irrevocably, stopped being the biggest story in the room. Zen-Oh did not summon council meetings so much as cause them. His attention alone was enough to bend a room into shape around whatever he wanted discussed, and every grand priest, angel, and god of destruction present understood implicitly that when both versions of the Omni King turned their small blue faces toward a single point in space, the correct response was immediate, undivided focus. Grand Priest, future Zen-Oh said, swinging his short legs where he sat. What are those two? The Grand Priest, tall, serene, silver-haired, a being whose calm had weathered the erasure of entire universes without so much as a raised eyebrow, allowed himself the smallest pause before answering. For a being of his composure, That pause was itself an event, and every angel in the room noticed it. "I do not know, Your Majesty." Present Zen-Oh's eyes widened with delight rather than alarm. Delight was, after all, his default response to nearly everything, including several events that had genuinely warranted terror. "You don't know? That's never happened before." "No," the Grand Priest agreed. "It has not." Whis, standing at his customary position near Beerus, offered the report he'd prepared with characteristic thoroughness and characteristic refusal to editorialize. "Their point of origin does not correspond to any of the 12 universes, nor to the Void, nor to any timeline I am aware of Zen-Oh having previously sanctioned or erased. Whatever passage brought them here appears to have been unintentional on their part, and unauthorized by anyone with jurisdiction to allow it. As for their nature," he paused, in the manner of a man choosing words for a wine he could not identify the vintage of. "One radiates an absence of measurable power that is, in itself, its own kind of terrifying signature. The other radiates something my instruments register as predatory, ancient and hungry, in ways that don't map cleanly onto ki, magic, or any destructive force I've previously catalogued." Beerus, arms folded, tail twitching, said what everyone in the room was already thinking, and none of the angels wanted to be first to voice. "So we have two things in our tournament that we can't measure, can't classify, and don't know if we can kill." "That is essentially correct, Lord Beerus." Champa, lounging with the particular smugness of a god who enjoyed watching his brother squirm, snorted from across the chamber. "Sounds like a Universe 7 problem to me." "They fell into a neutral zone, you overfed cushion," Beerus snapped. "It's everyone's problem the second the barrier doesn't drop." Future Zen-Oh tilted his head, genuinely curious rather than concerned. The concept of genuine danger to himself had simply never had cause to register as a category his mind needed to maintain. "Should we erase them, just to be safe?" The chamber went very still. It was the Grand Priest, ever measured, who answered first. "Your Majesty, with respect, erasure requires a target the erasure can reach. I would recommend, before attempting anything of that nature, that we confirm such a thing is even possible. An untested application of your authority against an unknown quantity, in full view of every universe's champions, carries risk I would rather assess than assume away." Present Zen-Oh nodded along amiably, as if this were the most reasonable suggestion in the world, which, coming from the only being whose caution actually mattered, it was. "Fine," Future Zen-Oh said, already losing interest in favor of the tournament's more pressing question. "Then what do we do?" It was Beerus who answered, because someone had to, and because the itch at the back of his neck had not stopped since he'd first laid eyes on the pair. "We watch, we test, carefully, not recklessly, and we find out what they want, because in my experience, that tells you more about a threat than its power level ever does." Down on the null space floor, what Saitama wanted, at that precise moment, remained stubbornly consistent: food and exit, and for the day to stop being complicated. Toppo had eventually, reluctantly, ordered his troopers to stand down from active engagement, not out of trust, but out of the calculation that provoking an unmeasurable quantity before understanding it was itself a form of recklessness his code of justice couldn't sanction. Instead, he'd requested, with the stiff formality of a man unused to requesting anything, that the two newcomers accompany the Pride Troopers to a secured section of the arena to await proper authority, by which he meant whichever combination of gods, angels, or Zen-Oh himself eventually decided to show up and take responsibility for the situation. Alucard had found the whole arrangement delightful. "Escorted," he mused, falling into step beside Dispo with unhurried, silent strides that somehow kept perfect pace with the speedster's fastest walking gait, without appearing to hurry at all. How quaint. The last time anyone attempted to escort me anywhere, it did not end well for the escort. Is that a threat? Dispo asked, not quite managing to keep the edge out of his voice. It's a fact. Threats imply uncertainty. I don't traffic in those. Alucard's smile didn't waver. But I find myself curious rather than hostile. For the moment, consider that a mercy, speed demon, and not a promise. Saitama, trudging along a few paces behind with his hands in his pockets, glanced sideways at his fellow stranded traveler. You always talk like that? Like what? Like a movie villain reading his own subtitles. Alucard actually laughed at that, the second time in an hour, which by his own internal accounting was something of a record. I've had considerably longer than you to develop a voice, bald one. Forgive me if it's ripened into something theatrical. Bald one, Saitama repeated flatly. Real original. I've been informed my names for people tend toward the functional. It saves time. They were led, escorted being, as Alucard had noted, a generous word for a procession flanked on all sides by wary pride troopers who kept their guard up with the specific tension of soldiers babysitting a bomb they didn't know how to defuse, across the strange, seamless expanse of the Null Realm's arena floor. Saitama took in the scenery with the mild, unimpressed interest of a tourist visiting a mall he'd already decided he wasn't going to buy anything from. The floating platforms, the churning not-quite void beneath them, the distant twinkle of what he assumed were stars but which Dispo, when asked, explained were actually the faint outlines of the 12 universes themselves, visible from the metaspace between them. So all that's, 12 whole universes, Saitama said, squinting up at the lights. 12, yes. And you're really gonna just delete some of them, if they lose. Dispo's jaw tightened. That's the Omni King's rule, not ours to question. Sounds like a great rule, Saitama said, in a tone that made abundantly clear he did not think it sounded like a great rule at all, for somebody who's never gonna be the one erased. Nobody had an answer for that. Even Topo, marching a few steps ahead with his booming certainty intact, found the silence that followed harder to fill than he expected. They reached the secured section, a smaller platform, cordoned off from the main arena, ringed by enough pride troopers to reassure Topo without provoking an incident, just as Whis descended from above in a slow, unhurried arc that ended with him landing as lightly as a falling leaf, staff in hand, expression pleasantly neutral. Ah, Whis said, looking between the two newcomers with the polite, appraising interest of a man examining a rare bottle of wine he wasn't yet sure was drinkable. You must be our uninvited guests. My name is Whis. I attend Lord Beerus, god of destruction of Universe 7. I do hope the escort wasn't too dramatic. They were pretty chill, actually, Saitama said. Except for the whole, you might get erased thing. Ah, yes. That is rather the crux of today's difficulty, isn't it? Whis's smile didn't waver, but his eyes, sharp, ancient, missing nothing, had already begun their quiet, careful cataloging of every detail the two of them offered. Posture, breathing, the way Saitama's weight distributed evenly and unremarkably across his stance, the way Alucard's shadow seemed to fall in a direction slightly disagreeing with the actual light source above them. You're the guy who's supposed to figure out what we are, Alucard said. It wasn't a question. I am the being tasked with attempting to. Yes, whether I succeed remains to be seen. I confess it's a novel experience, being unable to read something's power at a glance. I find I rather dislike it. Whis said this with the same mild tone he might use to describe a minor inconvenience at a restaurant, which Alucard noted with some private appreciation, was itself a kind of composure worth respecting. Then let's help you along, Alucard said, and before anyone could react, he moved. It wasn't fast in any way the pride trooper's trained eyes could track his motion. One instant he stood several paces from Whis, and the next he simply was closer, near enough that a mortal blade would have already found its mark. near enough that 3 Pride troopers had their fighting stances half-formed before their brains caught up to what their eyes had already missed. Whis had not moved at all. He hadn't needed to. His staff was already resting, with perfect unbothered calm, an inch from the center of Alucard's chest. Not touching, not threatening, simply present, the way a locked door is present before you try the handle. That, Whis said pleasantly, was rather rude. Alucard studied the staff, then the placid face behind it, and felt, for the first time since arriving in this strange, overbright cosmos, the small, genuine thrill of having found something that had not merely matched his speed, but had been waiting there before he'd finished deciding to move at all. "My apologies," he said, and meant it, in the particular way an old predator apologizes to something it has just realized might actually be dangerous. "I wanted to see how fast you were. I did not expect faster than fast." "A common mistake," Whis said serenely, withdrawing the staff. "I would ask that you not repeat it. Lord Beerus does not enjoy replacing furniture, and I suspect you would prove considerably harder to replace than furniture, should this platform not survive the next attempt." Toppo, several paces back, released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Dispo hadn't even managed that much. He was still staring at the space Alucard had occupied a half-second earlier, trying to reconcile what his eyes had recorded with what his instincts insisted should have been physically impossible for anything to accomplish that casually. Saitama, for his part, had watched the whole exchange with the flat, faintly bored expression of a man who had seen faster things fail to impress him plenty of times before. "Neat trick," he offered. "You always this fast? Or was that a special occasion?" "I find most occasions call for it, eventually," Whis said, turning his attention, and, Alucard noted, his genuine curiosity, toward the bald man for the first time. "And you? Your companion offered a demonstration. Would you care to offer one of your own?" "Not really my thing," Saitama said. "I don't really do demonstrations. Kinda ruins the surprise." "There is a surprise then. I mean, not really. It's just a punch." Saitama shrugged, hands still in his pockets, entirely unbothered by the fact that he was being politely, thoroughly assessed by a being who had just casually outmoved something ancient enough to unsettle Toppo's whole chain of command. "One punch. That's kinda it. That's the whole thing." Whis's smile remained pleasant, unreadable, and, very slightly, in a way only someone who'd known him for eons might have caught, a shade more interested than it had been a moment before. "How refreshingly economical," he said. "I do look forward to seeing it, someday. I suspect Lord Beerus will insist on it, once he finishes deciding how alarmed to be." That evening, if evening meant anything in a dimension built without a sun to set, Beerus paced the observation platform in the specific, restless manner of a cat that had been shown a closed door and told, with total sincerity, that opening it might end the world. "Whis tells me the coded one moved and you didn't even flinch," he said, to no one, to the air, to the general injustice of a day that had refused to make sense. "Whis tells me the bald one calls his power kinda just a punch. Whis tells me neither of them has a power level. What am I supposed to do with that, Whis?" "I would suggest patience, Lord Beerus," Whis said, arriving with a tray of tea he'd prepared with his usual unbothered grace, as though the day's events were no more disruptive than a change in weather. "We have time before the tournament resumes. Zen-Oh has agreed to delay the barrier's activation until we understand what we're dealing with. That is no small concession. It's a concession, because even he's unsettled." Beerus accepted the tea, drank it in a single motion that betrayed more agitation than he'd admit aloud. "In all my years, Whis, all my years, I have never once looked at something and felt." He stopped, searching for the word, and settled on one he clearly disliked using about himself. "Uncertain." "Then perhaps," Whis said, "that is itself useful information. Uncertainty, Lord Beerus, is simply data you haven't gathered yet. I propose we gather it. How? Whiss's smile turned, very faintly, sly. The particular expression of a man who had already begun composing the shape of a test, long before his god had asked for one. Carefully, he said, and with the bald one's own words in mind. He did say he doesn't do demonstrations after all. I find I would very much like to change his mind. Below them, far below, on the small cordoned platform where their two impossible guests had been left to wait, Saitama had fallen asleep sitting up, bored past the point of caution, snoring softly against the churning backdrop of a multiverse quietly rearranging its entire understanding of what power meant. Beside him, Alucard remained awake, watching the strange, star-strewn dark beyond the platform's edge with the patient, hungry attention of something that had, for the first time in a very long while, found a world worth the trouble of staying interested in. Beerus's test arrived 3 hours later, and it arrived, characteristically, without warning. Saitama woke to the specific, unpleasant sensation of gravity multiplying itself by a number his body had no reference point for. One moment he was dozing against the low railing of the cordoned platform. The next, the platform itself seemed to lurch, not physically but in some deeper, more fundamental sense. The air thickening, the light dimming a shade, the entire small enclosed space suddenly pressing down on him, like the sky had decided to sit on his chest. He opened his eyes, mildly annoyed, and found nothing had actually changed about how he felt. "Huh," he said, sitting up. "Weird." Across the platform, Toppo had gone rigid, one knee buckling slightly under a pressure his trained body understood immediately and instinctively as dangerous. A crushing, layered weight that hadn't existed a second ago, and now sat over the entire enclosure like a held breath. Dispo had dropped to a knee entirely, jaw clenched, sweat beading despite the Null Realm's controlled climate. Even the other Pride troopers stationed at the platform's edge had visibly stiffened, several reaching for stances that wouldn't help against something that wasn't attacking so much as simply existing, at a scale their bodies weren't built to share space with. Alucard notably had not moved at all, though something in his stillness had sharpened, the way a cat's ears sharpen at a sound only it can hear. "Ah," he said, mild, almost delighted. "There he is." Above them, descending in a slow, unhurried spiral that made the sheer scale of what he was doing look almost lazy, came Beerus, no longer bothering to mute the aura he usually kept folded away out of sheer boredom, with intimidating people who weren't worth the effort. This was not that aura. This was the god of destruction's true weight, unfiltered, the kind of presence that had, in less controlled moments across less controlled centuries, cracked planets, simply by arriving too close to them. He landed lightly on the platform's edge, tail curling, eyes half-lidded in an expression of studied, deliberate boredom that fooled absolutely no one who'd seen his tail's actual tension. "Good evening," he said. "I thought I'd introduce myself properly." Toppo, still fighting to keep his footing, managed through gritted teeth. "Lord Beerus, this wasn't sanctioned." "I'm sanctioning it now," Beerus said, without looking at him. His eyes were fixed entirely on the bald man across the platform, who was, Beerus noted, with the small, cold twist of something that felt uncomfortably close to alarm, still sitting exactly as he had been, unbothered, one hand scratching idly at the back of his neck like a man mildly irritated by a mosquito, rather than standing inside a god's full destructive presence. "You're the one everybody's freaking out about," Saitama said, glancing up. "Kinda intense entrance. You always do that, or was that for me?" "For you," Beerus confirmed. "I wanted to see how you'd respond to real pressure. Most things, when I stop holding back, forget how to stand. Some forget how to breathe." "Huh." Saitama considered this, then shrugged. "Doesn't really feel like much, honestly. kinda like standing in a strong wind. Is it supposed to hurt? Something in Beerus's expression flickered. Not fear. Gods of destruction did not experience fear in any framework mortals understood, but something adjacent to it. A recalibration happening rapidly, behind eyes that had just watched an entire cosmology of prior assumptions fail to apply. It has ended planets, Beerus said, very evenly, before now. Well, I mean, no offense, but I've had worse mornings. Saitama stood, stretching, apparently entirely unaware of, or entirely unbothered by, the fact that every Pride trooper on the platform was watching him with the specific, wide-eyed horror of men witnessing something their training had never once prepared them to categorize. Is this the part where we fight? 'Cause I really don't want to fight anybody today. I just want to find food. Beerus's tail lashed once, sharp. You don't want to fight, he repeated, disbelief threading through the careful, cultivated boredom of his usual register. Do you understand what I am? Some kind of space cat god, I'm guessing? Based on the... Saitama gestured vaguely at Beerus's general aesthetic. Whole thing you got going on. Look, I get it. You're strong. You erase planets. Real scary. Very impressive. I just don't really care that much. No offense. It's not like a you problem. Everybody's kind of the same to me after a while. The silence that followed was total. Even Alucard, who had been watching the entire exchange with the rapt, delighted attention of a man at a particularly good opera, allowed himself a low, genuine laugh, the sound cutting through the platform's tension like something sharp dragged across glass. Oh, I do like him, Alucard said, to no one. I like him quite a lot, actually. Beerus did not destroy the platform. This surprised precisely no one who understood him well. Beerus's threats, for all their theater, were rarely his first resort, and something in the bald man's utterly sincere, utterly uninterested dismissal of his power had shifted the god of destruction's calculus from irritated toward something far more useful, curious. Prove it, Beerus said instead. Prove what? That it's not a me problem. Hit me. Toppo's head snapped up. Lord Beerus. I said hit me, Beerus repeated, ignoring him entirely, eyes locked on Saitama with the fixed, hungry attention of a being who had not felt genuinely tested in longer than most civilizations had existed. One punch, you said. Show me. Saitama looked, for the first time since arriving in this strange bright cosmos, faintly uncomfortable. Not with the prospect of violence, but with something closer to reluctance. Look, man, I don't really like hitting stuff that hasn't, done anything to me. Kinda my whole thing. I only fight if there's a reason. Then I'll give you one. Beerus's smile turned sharp, all teeth, all challenge. Your entire species, wherever it is you're from, exists at my discretion. Every universe in this tournament exists because Zen-Oh permits it, and I could, if I chose, recommend it stop existing. That's reason enough, isn't it? Convince me you're worth the trouble of not doing that. It wasn't a fair framing. It was, notably, exactly the kind of framing calculated to work. Beerus had not survived this long as a god without understanding precisely which levers moved which kinds of beings, and something in Saitama's flat, easily bored demeanor had told him, correctly, that indifference could be provoked more easily than fear. Saitama's expression didn't change much, but something in his shoulders settled. The loose, unhurried readiness of a man who had made this exact decision 10,000 times before, and found it, every single time, exactly as anticlimactic as the last. Fine, he said. Your call. Don't say I didn't warn you, it's kinda boring. He didn't wind up. He didn't gather energy, didn't shift into a stance, didn't do any of the 1,000 small performative things that every fighter in the Null Realm, every Saiyan, every Pride Trooper, every god who'd ever thrown a punch worth remembering, had been trained since birth to do before committing to a strike. He just moved his fist forward. What happened next did not, strictly speaking, register as an event to most of the beings watching. There was no build-up they could track, no wind-up their trained eyes could parse into stages, no aura that flared to warn them a blow was coming. One instant Saitama's fist was at his side. The next, it had already connected, and the space around the point of impact simply folded. Not shattered, not exploded, folded, the way paper folds when a crease is pressed into it too hard. Reality itself buckling along a line that ran outward from Beerus's raised forearm, because Beerus had, in the single available fraction of a second his ancient reflexes afforded him, gotten an arm up to intercept the blow rather than take it clean. The shockwave that followed did not merely displace air, it displaced space, a visible ripple tearing outward across the platform, cracking the null space floor in spiderweb fractures that reached the platform's edge and kept going, out into the void beyond, a scar drawn across the fabric of a dimension that had, until a few hours ago, been considered stable and eternal by every god present. Toppo was thrown backward off his feet. Dispo, faster reflexes barely saving him, caught himself mid-stumble against a piece of debris that hadn't existed a half-second earlier. Every Pride trooper on the platform had been knocked flat, and above them, on the observation deck, Whiss's teacup had shattered in his hand, not from the shockwave itself, which his own defenses had absorbed without conscious effort, but from the sheer, involuntary flinch of a being who had not flinched at anything in longer than he cared to remember. Beerus stood at the platform's center, arms still raised, forearms smoking faintly where the blow had connected, expression frozen in something between shock and a kind of dawning, horrified respect. That, he said, very quietly, once the dust and the cracked light had settled enough for words to carry, was not boring. Saitama lowered his fist, already looking mildly disappointed. Yeah, told you. Always kinda underwhelming, honestly. You held back, Beerus said. It wasn't a question. His arm, a god of destruction's arm, capable of unmaking planets with a gesture, hung faintly numb at his side, and the platform beneath them both bore a crack that ran the length of the entire structure and showed no sign of wanting to heal. I mean, kinda. You blocked most of it. If I'd actually meant it, you probably wouldn't be standing there asking me about it. Saitama shrugged, entirely without malice. But like I said, didn't want to actually hurt you. Seemed rude, considering you didn't really do anything to deserve it. Just wanted to see what I could do. Whis descended slowly from the observation platform, cracked teacup still somehow, absurdly, held in one careful hand, expression for the first time since the two guests had arrived genuinely, unmistakably alarmed. Lord Beerus, he said, I would recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that we not do that again. Agreed, Beerus said, flexing his numbed arm with a wince he didn't bother hiding. Whis, I want the Grand Priest informed, immediately. And I want to know, he turned back toward Saitama, who had already lost interest and gone back to scanning the platform's ruined edges for any sign of an exit, whether that was truly everything, or whether I've just discovered I have absolutely no idea what everything means for you. Saitama didn't look back at him. Probably don't want to find out. Trust me. It's not as cool as it sounds. Far across the Null Realm, in a section of the arena reserved for Universe 11's contingent, Jiren had felt the shockwave ripple through the dimensional fabric itself. Not as sound, not quite as force, but as a disturbance in the deep, still place inside himself where he kept his awareness of the world's true shape. He opened his eyes, which had been closed in meditation, and did not move otherwise. Jiren? Toppo's voice crackled faintly over the arena's shared comm relay, still shaken from his own proximity to the blast. Did you feel that? Yes. Any read on the source? A long pause. Jiren considered the question with the same total, unhurried focus he gave every problem worth his attention, running the disturbance's shape back through every framework of power he'd ever measured himself against. Ultra Instinct Goku, Ultra Ego Vegeta, the gods of destruction themselves, and finding, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that none of them offered a clean comparison. "No," he said finally. "Whatever that was, it did not feel like power as I understand it. It felt like something choosing not to be measured." Toppo didn't have a response for that. Neither, notably, did anyone else on the comm relay, and the silence that followed carried, in its own quiet way, more weight than the shockwave itself had. Because if even Jiren, Universe 11's strongest, the being every other fighter in the tournament privately measured their own ceiling against, didn't know what to make of it, then whatever had just torn a crack across the Null Realm's floor wasn't merely strong. It was something the multiverse's entire existing hierarchy of power had no ready place to put. Alucard watched all of it, the crack spreading across the platform, Beerus's numbed arm, the sudden electric shift in how every god and warrior present now regarded his traveling companion, with an expression of open, undisguised delight that few of the assembled Pride Troopers found remotely reassuring. "You've made quite the impression," he said, once the immediate chaos had settled and Saitama had wandered back over, looking put upon as ever. "Wasn't trying to. Just wanted him to stop yelling at me." Alucard's smile widened, slow and considering. "It has been an extraordinarily long time since I found myself the less alarming of two guests somewhere. I find I rather enjoy the novelty." "Don't get used to it," Saitama said, dropping back down to sit against the cracked railing. "Pretty sure they're gonna want to test you next." Alucard's eyes drifted toward the observation platform above, where Whis stood in quiet, urgent conversation with Beerus, both of their gazes flicking, every few moments, in his direction rather than Saitama's. "Yes," he agreed, low and pleased, something ancient and patient unspooling behind his tinted glasses. "I rather suspect they are." Above, unheard by either of them, Whis was already saying to Beerus, in the careful, measured tone of a man choosing his next words with unusual care, "Lord Beerus, I don't believe testing the second one the same way would be wise. His signature reads nothing like the first's. I suspect we would learn a very different, and considerably more dangerous, kind of lesson." Whis's caution proved warranted faster than even he expected. The decision on how to approach the second guest was made not by Beerus, who, still nursing a numbed forearm and a badly dented sense of his own supremacy, had retreated to the observation deck to consult with the Grand Priest, but by Vados, Universe 6's attendant angel, who arrived unannounced partway through the aftermath with Champa in tow, and the specific, dry amusement of someone who'd heard about her counterpart's misadventure and wanted a closer look before forming an opinion. "I heard you got your arm broken by a bald man," Champa said, grinning wide, as he floated down onto what remained of the cracked platform. "That's the best thing I've heard all cycle." "It's not broken," Beerus snapped from the observation deck, loud enough to carry. "It's numb. There's a difference. Sounds like a broken arm with extra steps." "Do you want me to test you next, you overfed housecat?" Vados, ignoring the brothers entirely with the ease of someone who'd had eons of practice, drifted down toward the ruined platform's edge, staff in hand, violet eyes settling on Alucard with an interest that was, notably, more clinical than Whis's had been, less caution, more the sharp, appraising curiosity of a scientist encountering a genuinely novel specimen. "You're the other one," she said, "the one my counterpart is so reluctant to provoke." "So I'm told." Alucard rose from where he'd been lounging against the railing, unhurried, the motion carrying the particular fluid stillness that had already unsettled every Pride Trooper present once today. "You have the look of someone who didn't get the memo about caution." "I got the memo," I simply don't find it as convincing as Whis does. Vados's smile was thin, pleasant, and entirely without warmth. He measures danger by force. I find it useful to measure it by intention first. Force without intention is just weather. So, what do you intend, stranger, now that you've fallen into a multiverse that isn't yours? It was, Alucard noted with something like genuine appreciation. A better question than Beerus's blunt demand for a demonstration. Force he could perform without cost. Intention required him to actually answer something true. I intend, he said slowly, turning the thought over with evident relish, to find out whether this place is capable of surprising me. It has been an extraordinarily long time since anything has. Your Lord Beerus's little display with the bald one. He gestured toward the cracked platform floor, still fractured in long, spidering lines. Was the first surprise I've had in longer than you'd believe. I find myself curious whether there's more where that came from. Whether I have anything left in me worth calling a surprise, after all these centuries. That's not an intention. That's an appetite. Is there a difference in a being old enough? Vados considered him for a long moment, staff resting lightly against her shoulder, and something in her expression, not fear. Angels did not experience fear any more readily than gods of destruction did, but a kind of sharpened, deliberate attention settled into place. Champa, she said, without looking away from Alucard, I'd like to test something, with your permission. Do whatever you want, Champa said, already bored, floating back to watch from a safer distance. Just don't break anything I have to pay for. What Vados proposed was, by her own admission, considerably more surgical than Beerus's approach had been. Not a raw contest of force, which she suspected, correctly, would only feed whatever appetite the pale stranger was nursing, but a test of the specific thing Whis's report had flagged as most unreadable. Whether Alucard's power responded to destruction-based attacks the way anything mortal, or even divine, was supposed to. Hakai, she said, raising 2 fingers, violet energy gathering at their tips with the quiet, absolute certainty of a technique that had never, in the history of any universe present, failed to erase what it touched. You've heard the word, I assume, by now. I have. Your Lord Beerus's assistant was kind enough to explain it, in the abstract, while I was being escorted about like a suspicious parcel. Alucard's smile didn't waver, though something behind his eyes sharpened into real focus for the first time since arriving. A technique that erases its target from existence. Rather absolute for a technique. It's not meant to be survivable. That's rather the point of it. How refreshing. Most things that claim to be absolute in my experience have, without exception, been wrong. Alucard spread his arms slightly. An invitation. Red coat shifting like something with its own quiet hunger. Do be thorough. I'd hate to think you held back out of politeness. Vados did not hold back. The Hakai bolt that left her fingers was small, deliberately so, a scalpel rather than a hammer, calibrated to test rather than annihilate outright, but it carried within its compact violet light the same fundamental principle that made every god of destruction's power what it was. Not force in any conventional sense, but erasure itself, a directive aimed at the very concept of a target's continued existence, rather than merely its physical form. It struck Alucard's center mass, and nothing happened. Not nothing as in the bolt failed to connect. Vados's aim was, as always, impeccable, but nothing as in the specific, deep unmaking the technique was built to enact, simply found no purchase. The violet light spread across Alucard's chest, sank into the fabric of his coat like water into cloth, and dissipated there, fading into the same shadow that pooled perpetually around his shoulders, as though the erasure itself had been absorbed, digested, and found, mildly interesting, and nothing more. Alucard looked down at his own chest with an expression of genuine, delighted surprise. "Oh," he said, "that tickled." Vados's staff lowered, very slightly, her composure, that eternal unbothered angelic calm, cracking for just long enough to register as a flicker of something closer to real alarm. That technique, she said, carefully, does not tickle. It does not do anything so gentle as tickle. It removes the target from the register of things that exist. Then I imagine that's rather awkward for you, Alucard said, given that I still, very much, exist. Why? It wasn't posed as a demand. It was, Vados realized even as she said it, the closest thing to a genuine question she'd asked anyone in longer than she cared to count. The specific, rare admission of a being who had just watched her own foundational understanding of destruction fail to apply, and who wanted, more than she wanted to maintain her composure, an actual answer. Alucard considered the question with real care, turning it over the way a connoisseur turns a rare vintage, weighing whether it deserved his honesty. Because, he said finally, erasure only works on things that believe, on some level, in their own ending. Your technique is elegant. I don't doubt it's ended gods before now, but it is a conversation with its target, a proposal that says you should stop existing now, and most things, on some deep and instinctive level, agree. I have not agreed to stop existing in a very, very long time. I'm not certain I remember how. That's not an answer. That's a riddle. It's the only answer I have. I've never needed a better one. His smile turned, for the first time since the two of them had begun speaking, genuinely serious, the theatrical menace stripped back to something older and colder underneath. I would ask, Angel, that you not try that again. Not because it will hurt me. It won't. But because I find myself curious what happens if you keep insisting, and I no longer entirely trust myself with the answer to that question. It was, Vados understood immediately, not a threat in the conventional sense. It was, worse in its way, an honest warning, delivered by something old enough and controlled enough to know precisely where its own limits sat, and precisely how close this conversation had already brought them. She lowered her hand fully, staff settling back against her shoulder, expression smoothing back into its usual dry composure with visible effort. Understood, she said. I won't repeat the test, but I will be reporting this to the Grand Priest in full, and I suspect he'll want words with Zen-Oh sooner rather than later. By all means. Alucard inclined his head, courtly, unbothered. I do so enjoy being discussed by people important enough to matter. The report that reached the Grand Priest that evening did not, notably, recommend panic. It recommended something the assembled angels found considerably harder to action: patience. Neither can be measured by our usual instruments, the Grand Priest said, addressing the full assembly of gods, angels, and, at Zen-Oh's specific, curious request, several of the tournament's strongest mortal competitors, gathered now in the grand chamber above the Null Realms arena. Goku and Vegeta stood near the front, having been briefed only minutes earlier, and wearing matching expressions of barely contained excitement that neither Whis nor Vados found remotely appropriate to the situation. The Bald One's power, when finally demonstrated, exceeded Lord Beerus's own defensive capacity, not by a small margin, but by an amount Lord Beerus himself has declined to fully quantify. The Coded One appears entirely immune to Hakai, our order's oldest and most absolute technique, for reasons he describes as philosophical rather than physical. Philosophical, Champa repeated, delighted. Love that. Very helpful. Very actionable. He also, Vados added, with the flat, dry precision of someone still recalibrating her own composure, described erasure as a conversation the target has to agree to. I don't fully understand what that means. I don't think he fully understands it either. I do believe he was being sincere. Goku, near the front, had been practically vibrating since the briefing began, and finally couldn't hold it in any longer. So can we fight them? Like, is that on the table? 'Cause that guy who punched Beerus sounds awesome. Goku. Vegeta's voice carried the specific, weary exasperation of a man who had spent years failing to curb this exact impulse. Read the room. We are discussing an entity that broke a god of destruction's arm without trying, and your first instinct is, can I fight him? Well, yeah, that's kinda always my first instinct. It is always your first instinct, and it is never the correct one. To be fair, Whis interjected mildly, in this specific instance, testing him through combat may genuinely be the most efficient way to gather further data, provided, he added, with a pointed look at Goku, it is done with considerably more restraint than Lord Beerus managed. That was one time. It was one time in the last several hours Lord Beerus, Zen-Oh, seated at the head of the chamber, and following the exchange with his usual bright, untroubled attention, finally spoke, and the room fell instantly, completely silent, the reflexive hush that greeted any pronouncement from the being whose whim alone had erased entire universes without ceremony. I want the tournament to still happen, future Zen-Oh said. Me too, present Zen-Oh agreed. But I also want to know more about the two new ones first. They're interesting. Grand Priest, can we do both? The Grand Priest inclined his head, the practiced immediate deference of a being who had long since learned that Zen-Oh's simplest questions carried the heaviest implications. It is within your Majesty's authority to delay the barrier's activation further, if you wish it. I would suggest, if the two newcomers are to remain in the null realm regardless, that we use the time productively, assess them further, and determine whether their presence here constitutes a threat requiring intervention, or an opportunity worth incorporating into the tournament's structure. Incorporating, Beerus repeated slowly, tail going still. You mean, put them in the tournament? It is one option among several, Lord Beerus. I make no recommendation yet. I simply note that a being who cannot be erased, and a being who considers destruction itself unconvincing are, whatever else they may be, powerful enough to matter to the outcome, whether we choose to include them or not. Across the chamber, unseen by most of the assembly, Frieza, present as Universe 7's most reluctant and most closely watched participant, arms folded, expression carrying its usual cold, calculating amusement, had said nothing throughout the entire briefing. But his eyes, sharp and patient, had not left the report's details for a single moment, and something in the particular quality of his silence suggested he was already turning the newcomer's description over in his mind, weighing them not as threats to be cautious of, but as variables, pieces on a board whose value depended entirely on who got to them first, and what they could be convinced to want. Back on the cordoned platform, still faintly smoking at its cracked edges, Saitama had finally, after several hours of increasingly desperate negotiation with a passing Pride Trooper logistics officer, secured something that technically qualified as food. A strange, dense, vaguely purple ration bar that Universe 11's forces apparently carried for extended deployments. He chewed through it with the flat, resigned disappointment of a man who had been hoping for ramen and received cardboard. Not great, he announced, to no one. Alucard, seated nearby, had declined the offered ration entirely, and had instead spent the last hour watching the distant lights of the 12 universes, with an expression that had, gradually, shifted from idle curiosity into something quieter, more contemplative. They're afraid, he said finally. Not of us specifically. Not yet. Afraid of the shape of us. Of the fact that their entire cosmology has a hole in it now, exactly where we're standing. Yeah, well. Saitama tossed the empty ration wrapper aside. Get in line. Everybody's afraid of that eventually. Doesn't really change much, in my experience. People get used to it, or they don't, and it's their problem, not mine. You truly don't care, do you? Not out of cruelty, just, genuinely. It doesn't move you. Saitama considered the question with more seriousness than he usually afforded anything, staring out at the same distant lights Alucard had been watching. I used to care, he admitted finally. A long time ago. Back when things could actually, challenge me, scare me, make me feel like I was doing something that mattered. He shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than his flat tone suggested. Then everything just stopped being hard, and I kept waiting for something to change that, and it never did. So yeah, I don't care much anymore. Not 'cause I don't want to, just 'cause there's nothing left to care about. Alucard was quiet for a long moment, turning the confession over with the same careful attention he'd given Vados's Hakai bolt, testing it, weighing whether it held real substance beneath its surface. I understand that better than you might expect, he said finally. I have existed considerably longer than you, I suspect, and for most of it, the same problem has haunted me. Immortality without challenge is not a gift. It is simply a very long, very quiet room. Yeah, well, Saitama glanced sideways at him, and for the first time since they'd fallen into this strange, bright cosmos together, something like real, unguarded curiosity flickered across his usually bored expression. Guess we'll find out together then, whether this place has actually got something in it. 'Cause if that cat god back there was really their strongest, he shook his head, unimpressed. I'm gonna be pretty disappointed. Alucard's smile, when it came, was slow, genuine, and for the first time, entirely without theater. Oh, he said, I don't think that cat god was anywhere near their strongest. I think, Bald One, we have found ourselves in a much, much larger room than either of us expected. Above them, unnoticed by either, the crack in the null space floor from Saitama's earlier punch had begun, faintly, almost imperceptibly, to widen. The Grand Priest's recommendation, once formally delivered to Zen-Oh, resolved into a decision within the hour. The Tournament of Power would proceed on its original schedule, but with a new, unprecedented addendum. The two newcomers would not be forced into combat. They would be offered it, a formal invitation, extended by Zen-Oh's own authority, to participate as an unaffiliated 13th party, outside the 12 universes stakes, answerable to no erasure clause, and bound to no team. You'd fight for nothing, Toppo said, when the offer was relayed to them by a visibly uncomfortable Whis. No universe on the line, no prize beyond the Omni King's curiosity being satisfied. Why would either of you agree to that? Saitama, sprawled against the cracked railing with the specific boredom of a man who had already decided the answer before the question finished, shrugged. Beats sitting here waiting for a bus that's never gonna come. Alucard's answer was less practical, and considerably more honest. Because I have not been interested in anything in longer than your entire civilization has existed, trooper. And interest, once found, is not a thing I discard lightly. Consider it accepted, on my end, gladly. What neither of them fully grasped, because neither had been told, and because Whis, delivering the offer, had chosen his wording with the deliberate, careful omission of a man managing information he suspected would complicate an already delicate situation, was that their participation had not been proposed purely out of curiosity. It had been proposed in no small part because Frieza had asked for it. The request had come to the Grand Priest through unofficial channels. Frieza did not, as a rule, make requests through official ones, preferring the particular deniability of suggestions dropped in the right ear at the right moment. He had found Whis alone on the observation deck an hour after the briefing concluded, and had approached with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his long and violent career doubted his own charm. An interesting pair, Frieza had said, without preamble, admiring the view of the null realm below, rather than looking at Whis directly. I find myself curious what they'd do, given the right incentive. I imagine most things would be curious about that, Lord Frieza. But you and I both know curiosity isn't worth much without application. That bald one. Frieza's tail had curled with slow, contemplative interest. He says he doesn't fight without reason. That's not indifference, Whis. That's a lever. Somewhere in that man is a reason large enough to move him, and I find myself wondering whether Universe 7's interests might be served by being the one who finds it first. Whis, for his part, had given nothing away, his pleasant, unbothered smile remaining perfectly intact throughout the entire exchange. That's a rather ambitious project, Lord Frieza, for a being who is, if I recall correctly, currently on something of a leash regarding unsanctioned schemes. A leash implies a leash holder who's paying attention. Frieza had smiled, thin and cold, and departed without another word, leaving Whis with the distinct, unpleasant certainty that whatever Frieza intended, it had already begun, quietly, somewhere out of sight. He had not mentioned the conversation to Beerus. He had, however, made a private note to watch Frieza considerably more closely over the coming sections of whatever this strange new chapter of the tournament was about to become. The formal exhibition match, Zen-Oh's compromise, half-tournament, half-controlled experiment, was set for the following cycle, in a specially reinforced arena carved fresh into the Null Realm's fabric, strong enough, in theory, to withstand whatever the two newcomers proved capable of without threatening the 12 universes' pillars nearby. Goku had volunteered before anyone else could. This surprised no one. "You sure about this?" Vegeta asked, watching Goku stretch out his shoulders with the loose, easy anticipation of a man about to do something he'd been dreaming of since the briefing ended. "Beerus's arm is still numb, Kakarot. That's not a small thing to shrug off." "That's exactly why I gotta do it," Goku said, grinning. "Come on, Vegeta. When's the last time something actually made you feel like this? Like you don't even know what's gonna happen?" Vegeta didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer, not since Broly, and even that had a ceiling I understood, sat somewhere he wasn't in the habit of admitting aloud. Instead, he folded his arms and said, with the particular gruffness that had become his substitute for actual warmth, "Don't die. I'm not explaining that to Chi-Chi. No promises. Kakarot. Kidding, mostly." The arena, when the appointed hour arrived, had drawn a crowd unlike anything the Tournament of Power had seen even at its official opening. Every god of destruction present, every angel, a healing cluster of Universe 11's Pride Troopers, still nursing bruised confidence from their earlier proximity to Saitama's punch, and, seated in a place of quiet, careful observation near the back, Frieza, watching everything with the patient, calculating stillness of a predator content to let others make the first move. Goku stood at one end of the reinforced platform, already in his base form, deliberately holding back the transformation he knew, with the specific instinct of a Saiyan who'd spent a lifetime learning to read a fight before it started. He'd need eventually, but not yet, because starting at full strength against an unknown quantity would tell him nothing about what that quantity actually was. Saitama stood at the other end, hands in his pockets, looking, as ever, like a man waiting for a bus, rather than a man about to participate in the single most watched exhibition match in the multiverse's recorded history. "You're pretty relaxed for someone about to fight a Saiyan," Whis observed, from his position as designated referee, a role he'd accepted with visible, if well-concealed, reluctance. "I'm pretty relaxed for most things," Saitama said. "Kinda my whole deal." Beerus, still favoring one arm, called out from the sidelines with the specific bitterness of a god still nursing wounded pride. "Kakarot, don't hold back on my account. If he's going to break something, better it's yours than mine a second time." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Goku called back, grinning, before settling into his opening stance. Whis raised his staff. "Begin." Goku moved first, a testing burst of speed, closing the distance in a blur that had, in any prior tournament, any prior opponent, been more than sufficient to end a fight before the other party finished registering it had started. His fist came in at an angle calculated to read Saitama's reaction rather than land cleanly. The opening move of a fighter who understood, better than almost anyone alive, that the first exchange of any real fight was a conversation, not a conclusion. Saitama caught the punch between two fingers. The arena went silent. "Huh," Saitama said, examining Goku's fist where it hung. Immobile, pinned between his thumb and forefinger with an ease that made the display feel almost incidental. Not a display of strength at all, simply the natural, unremarkable consequence of two very different scales of power, occupying the same space. "You're fast. That's actually kinda cool." Goku, to his considerable credit, didn't panic. He'd trained his entire life to keep his head in exactly this kind of moment, and instead of freezing, he grinned. Wide, genuine, the specific, delighted grin of a man who had just found, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, an opponent whose ceiling he genuinely could not see. "Cool, huh? Then how about this?" He didn't try to pull his fist free. Instead, in the same instant, his aura ignited, gold light cascading outward, hair lifting and shifting, the transformation into Super Saiyan Blue completing itself in a fraction of a second, power surging through the still-trapped fist in an attempt to simply overwhelm the grip holding it. Saitama's fingers didn't move, not a fraction, not a tremor. "Nice light show," he said, "but that's not really how this works." He let go. Goku staggered back half a step, not from force. There had been no force in the release, only its sudden absence, but from the sheer, dawning realization settling into his gut that the being standing across from him, still slouched, still hands mostly in his pockets, had held his fully powered Super Saiyan Blue punch as an afterthought, with two fingers, without so much as tensing. "Okay," Goku said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not fear. Goku didn't do fear well even when the situation called for it, but a kind of pure, electric focus he reserved for the rarest opponents of his life. "Okay, I'm not gonna hold back anymore." "Good," Saitama said, "'cause I still haven't actually hit you yet." What followed was, by every account later given by every witness present, less a fight than a demonstration of scale. Goku, at full Super Saiyan Blue, then pushing into the deeper, more dangerous edges of Kaioken layered atop it, throwing every technique 2 decades of relentless training had built into his arsenal, moving faster than sound, striking with force that had, in prior contests, ended gods. None of it landed cleanly. Saitama's movements weren't fast, not in the way Goku understood fast. There was no blur, no afterimage, no visible strain of a body pushing past its limits. He simply wasn't where the punch arrived, an instant before it got there, with the same casual, unhurried precision of a man stepping around a puddle he'd noticed well in advance. "You're not even trying," Goku said, breathing hard now, sweat beading despite his transformed state, the first real edge of frustration entering a voice that had, until this exact fight, rarely needed to carry it. "I mean, kinda. I told you, I don't really like hurting people who haven't done anything to deserve it." "You're not really trying to hurt me either, right? You're just testing." "Yeah, but..." "So I'm just testing back. Seems fair." Saitama tilted his head, genuinely considering something for the first time since the match began. "You want me to actually hit you? 'Cause I really don't think that's a good idea, based on what I did to the cat guy." Goku's grin returned, fierce and unbowed despite the exhaustion visibly creeping into his transformed frame. "Yeah, I do. I want to know, even if it hurts." Whis, watching from the sidelines with his staff raised and ready to intervene at the first sign of genuine danger, felt Beerus's hand close around his arm, a silent, urgent signal to be ready. "Whis," Beerus said quietly, "if he actually commits, I know, Lord Beerus. I'm watching. Saitama studied Goku for a long moment. Really studied him. The first time since arriving in this strange bright cosmos that his usual boredom had fully given way to something like genuine, careful consideration. And then, slowly, shook his head. Nah, he said. Not today. You've got something left to fight for that I don't think you've shown me yet. And I'm not gonna be the reason it gets cut short before you find out what it is. Match is over. I'm done. He turned and walked off the platform without waiting for Whis to call it, hands back in his pockets, leaving Goku standing there, transformed, breathing hard, and, for the first time in his entire life, genuinely, thoroughly unable to tell whether he'd just been shown mercy or dismissed as not worth the trouble. He wasn't sure, in that moment, which possibility bothered him more. Goku didn't speak for a long time after the match ended. He powered down slowly, the gold light of Super Saiyan Blue fading back into black, and stood alone at the center of the reinforced platform, while the crowd around him dissolved into a low, urgent murmur of disbelief and recalculation. Vegeta reached him first, expression unreadable in the specific way that meant he was working hard to keep it that way. Kakarot. He held back, Goku said, still staring at the spot where Saitama had stood. The whole time, I threw everything I had, Kaioken, Blue, all of it, and he wasn't even trying. I saw, that's not. Goku shook his head, searching for words that didn't usually give him this much trouble. That's not like fighting Jiren. Jiren pushes back. Jiren makes you earn every inch. This guy just wasn't there, like fighting weather. Vegeta's jaw tightened, because he recognized the particular flavor of what Goku was wrestling with. The same vertigo he'd felt himself, watching from the sidelines, watching a fight that had never actually been a fight at all, just a very patient man declining, over and over, to end something the moment he chose to. He said you had something left to fight for that he hadn't seen yet. What do you think he meant? I don't know. Goku finally looked up, and something in his expression had shifted, not defeated. Goku was constitutionally incapable of staying defeated for long, but sharpened, the way a blade sharpens against a stone it can't yet cut through. But I want to find out. Whatever it is. I want to find the thing that makes him actually swing. Not everyone in the arena had watched the match with the same awed uncertainty. Frieza had observed the entire exchange from his customary seat near the back, with the stillness of a man cataloging a weapon he had not yet decided how to acquire. Where others saw an unbeatable force, Frieza, ever the strategist, ever allergic to the idea that anything was simply unbeatable, saw instead a pattern worth exploiting, a being whose restraint was, itself, a lever. Saitama had declined to hurt Goku not because he couldn't, but because Goku hadn't given him a reason compelling enough. Everyone has a reason compelling enough, Frieza thought, watching the bald man walk off the platform, with visible disinterest in his own victory. One simply has to find the correct one. He found Alucard before the crowd had fully dispersed, approaching with the same smooth, unhurried confidence he'd used on Whis. Though this time, he suspected, a rather different approach would be required. That was illuminating, Frieza said, falling into step beside him as the vampire made his way along the arena's edge, apparently in no hurry to be anywhere in particular. Your companion, declining to finish a fight he'd already won several times over. Tell me, does that restraint extend to you as well? Or are you rather more willing to see things through to their conclusion? Alucard's smile, when it came, carried an edge Frieza's considerable experience recognized immediately as interest. The specific, dangerous interest of something old and patient that had just been offered a conversation worth having. That depends entirely, Alucard said, on what conclusion is being proposed, and by whom. You're the small one who's been watching from the back of every room since we arrived. I'd wondered when you'd introduce yourself properly. Frieza, Emperor, formerly, of a rather considerable stretch of the cosmos. Currently a complicated guest of this tournament, shall we say. A villain, then, dressed rather more politely than most I've known. A survivor, Frieza corrected, unbothered. There's a difference, though I confess the line blurs more than I'd like to admit. I find myself curious about you, however, not your strength, which appears formidable enough that curiosity about it seems almost redundant. I'm curious what you want. Every being strong enough to matter wants something. I've built entire empires on correctly identifying what that something is. Alucard considered the question with real deliberation, the theatrical menace of his usual register dropping away into something quieter, older, and, Frieza noted with interest, genuinely uncertain. I want, Alucard said finally, to remember what it felt like to be afraid of losing something. I have not felt that in longer than I can accurately measure. Immortality, Emperor, is a curse dressed as a gift. You accumulate power until nothing can threaten you, and then you discover, too late, that the threat was the only thing making any of it matter. Frieza's smile widened, slow and genuinely delighted. The expression of a man who had just found exactly the lever he was looking for. How fascinating. As it happens, I know this multiverse rather intimately, and I can assure you, there are things here still capable of threatening even you. Things worth losing. Would you care for a proper introduction? I find I'm rather good at arranging those. That, Alucard said, red eyes gleaming with something that hadn't surfaced in decades, sounds like precisely the kind of proposal I fell into this multiverse hoping to receive. Neither of them noticed, or if they did, neither cared to remark upon it, that Whis, several dozen meters away, had gone very quiet, watching the exchange with the specific, careful attention of a man filing away a piece of information he suspected would matter considerably more than either party currently intended. That evening, in the quieter aftermath of the exhibition match, Beerus summoned a smaller council, himself, Whis, the Grand Priest, and, at Whis's own careful insistence, Vados, to discuss what the day's events had actually established. So, Beerus paced, arms still faintly stiff, tail flicking with restless agitation. The bald one can end a fight whenever he chooses, and chooses not to, out of some kind of moral accounting system I don't fully understand. The coded one is immune to Hakai, for reasons that amount to philosophical stubbornness, and Frieza is now cozying up to the coded one, for reasons I can only assume are catastrophic. That is, broadly, an accurate summary, Lord Beerus, the Grand Priest said. I don't like it. I don't imagine you're meant to. Vados, arms folded, offered the observation that had been sitting with her since her own encounter on the cracked platform. I don't think either of them is dangerous in the way we initially feared. Not malicious danger, but they're both hungry, in different ways. The bald one is hungry for something to actually challenge him, and increasingly frustrated that nothing has. The coded one is hungry for something to fear losing. Those are not villains' appetites. But they're not safe appetites either. A being that powerful, bored enough, unmoored enough, that's precisely the kind of thing that starts making its own entertainment, if nobody offers it any. Which is exactly what Frieza appears to be doing, Whis said quietly. Offering entertainment. I overheard enough of their conversation to worry that whatever Frieza intends to arrange as an introduction will not have this multiverse's best interests at its center. Beerus's tail went rigid. What did he say? Exactly. Something about there being things in this multiverse still capable of threatening even an immortal creature. I don't know what he meant, but I know Frieza well enough to trust that whatever it is, it will benefit Frieza considerably more than it benefits us. The Grand Priest was quiet for a long moment, weighing the report with his usual unhurried care. Then perhaps, he said finally, The correct response is not further containment, but genuine engagement, before Frieza's version of an introduction becomes the only one they receive. I would recommend, Lord Beerus, that Universe 7 extend a more sincere welcome. Goku, in particular, seemed to make a genuine impression today, restraint and all. If these two beings are searching for meaning in a cosmos that has stopped being able to threaten them, better they find it among those with something to teach them than among those looking merely to use them. Beerus considered this for a long moment, tail twitching, pride and pragmatism warring visibly across his expression before pragmatism, as it usually did with Beerus when the stakes were high enough, won out. "Fine," he said. "Whis, arrange something. Properly this time. No more testing them like specimens. If Frieza wants to court them with promises of danger, we'll counter with something he can't offer." "And what's that, Lord Beerus?" Beerus's smile turned, slowly, into something almost sly. "Honesty. It's a rarer commodity than danger in my experience, and considerably harder for someone like Frieza to fake convincingly." Saitama, meanwhile, had found something almost resembling contentment, not from the match, which he'd already filed away as another disappointing entry in a very long list, but from the discovery, made purely by accident, that the Null Realm's catering staff, a detail of Universe Peaceful World's support crew, drafted in to feed the tournament's assembled competitors, kept a small stock of genuinely decent instant noodles tucked away for emergencies. "This is way better than that purple ration thing," he announced, slurping contentedly, seated on an overturned supply crate near the arena's edge. Alucard found him there some time later, having parted ways with Frieza with a promise to discuss the particulars further, a phrase that, had Saitama been paying closer attention to anything other than his noodles, might have concerned him considerably more than it did. "You look pleased," Alucard observed, settling nearby with his usual unhurried grace. "Found noodles. Real victory today." Saitama glanced up, taking in something in Alucard's expression he couldn't quite place. A kind of restless, sharpened energy that hadn't been there before the match. "You look like you found something too. What's up?" "A conversation," Alucard said, with a rather charming little tyrant who claims to know where genuine danger might still be found in this multiverse. I confess I'm inclined to hear him out. Saitama's noodle slurping paused, just slightly. "The purple guy? The one who was staring at us the whole match like he was doing math? That's the one. Yeah, I don't love that guy. Kinda got a vibe. Most interesting things have a vibe, bald one. I've learned not to let that stop me." Alucard's smile was easy, unconcerned, but something underneath it carried a weight Saitama, for all his boredom, didn't miss. "I've been without real stakes for longer than you've been alive, several times over. If there's a genuine door to walk through here, I intend to walk through it, regardless of who happens to be holding it open." Saitama chewed thoughtfully, considering this with more care than he usually afforded most things. "Just be careful," he said finally. "I've dealt with guys like that before. Back home, the ones who smile a lot and know exactly what you want before you say it. They're never doing it for you." "No," Alucard agreed, standing, already turning toward wherever Frieza's promised introduction was waiting. "I don't imagine he is, but I find I don't much care whose reasons get me there, so long as the destination is genuinely dangerous." He left without waiting for a response, red coat trailing into the Null Realm's strange half-light, and Saitama watched him go with the specific, quiet unease of a man who had seen this particular story before, in 100 smaller forms, and knew, without needing to see the ending, exactly how badly it tended to go. Frieza's introduction took the form of a name, delivered 3 days later, once he'd finished the careful, patient legwork of confirming it was actually possible. "Moro," he said, over a private dinner arranged in Universe 7's observation quarters, an indulgence Frieza had insisted upon, claiming the setting mattered for a conversation of this caliber. He'd had the room's lighting adjusted to something dimmer, more theatrical, and had procured wine from a cellar Alucard suspected he had no legitimate claim to. A planet-eating sorcerer, currently imprisoned in a dimension called the Galactic Prison, in a timeline somewhat adjacent to this one's current position. He devours entire worlds, not their surface, their life energy, down to the marrow of the planet itself. He escaped confinement once already, and very nearly consumed this reality's Earth, before Goku and his allies stopped him. I happen to know precisely which cell holds him, and precisely how thin the seal on that cell has become. Alucard turned his wineglass slowly between two fingers, watching the dark liquid catch the room's low light. You want me to free him? I want you to meet him, Frieza corrected, smooth and unhurried. What happens after that is entirely your own affair. I merely think you'd find him considerably more interesting than a Hakai bolt or a god's numbed forearm. He has, after all, consumed beings that make gods of destruction look like children playing at power. If anything in this multiverse is capable of giving you the fear you claim to be missing, I suspect it's him. And what do you get in return for this generous gift? Frieza's smile sharpened, genuine for perhaps the first time in the entire conversation. Information. Data. I am, at present, somewhat constrained in this tournament, watched closely, kept on what your bald friend would no doubt call a leash. I cannot test my own limits the way I'd like, but I can watch someone else test theirs and learn a great deal from the results. Call it professional curiosity. Call it using me. Call it, Frieza said, entirely unbothered, a mutually beneficial arrangement between two beings who understand precisely what they are to each other and don't waste time pretending otherwise. I find that considerably more honest than most alliances I've been offered in my very long life. Alucard studied him for a long moment, the cold, patient calculation behind every word, the total absence of any real warmth dressed up in perfectly convincing hospitality, and found, to his own faint surprise, that he respected it. It was, at least, honest dishonesty, which was a rarer thing than either of them would admit. Very well, he said finally, setting down the wineglass, untouched. Take me to your prison, Emperor. Let's see if your planet-eater is worth the trouble of freeing. What Frieza had not mentioned, what he had, in fact, deliberately omitted, weighing the risk against the reward and deciding the omission served him better, was that the Galactic Prison seal was not merely thin. It was, according to the Galactic Patrol's own most recent reports, actively failing. The residual damage from Moro's first escape years prior never fully repaired, held together now by a patchwork of temporary containment fields that a being of Alucard's power wouldn't need to break so much as simply lean against. He didn't know this. Alucard didn't know this either. As Frieza led him through a series of quiet, unofficial channels, favors called in, guards discreetly redirected, the specific bureaucratic sleight of hand that a being who'd once ruled a significant portion of the universe still knew how to perform even in diminished circumstances, toward a remote sector of space where the Galactic Prison's ancient, half-forgotten structure hung in silent orbit around a dead star. Rather unassuming, Alucard observed, studying the structure's exterior. A squat, functional fortress, its once formidable defenses visibly aged, patched in places with newer, cruder technology that spoke of a facility stretched well past its original purpose. Most true dangers are, Frieza said. Spectacle is for things that need to be feared. Moro has never needed spectacle. He simply is what he is, and that has always been more than enough. They found the specific containment cell, deep within the prison's lower levels, past security measures Frieza navigated with the ease of a man who'd clearly done considerable homework, sealed behind a shimmering barrier of pale energy, thin enough in places that Alucard could see, faintly, the shape of something vast and patient waiting on the other side. The moment Alucard's presence registered against the barrier, not an attack, not even an approach, merely proximity, something on the other side of the seal stirred. "New," a voice said, from within the cell, ancient and hungry, and edged with a curiosity that made even Frieza, who had planned this entire encounter with the confident detachment of a chess player several moves ahead, go very still. "You are new. I have not tasted new in a very long time." "Moro," Frieza said, keeping his voice level with visible effort. "I've brought you a guest. I trust you'll be a gracious host." "Gracious," the voice repeated, and something in its tone suggested the word amused it. "I have eaten planets whole, small emperor. I have consumed the life of worlds down to their last root and river. Gracious is not a word that survives contact with me for very long." Alucard, for his part, had gone very quiet, studying the shimmering barrier with an expression that had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from theatrical anticipation into something more genuinely alert. The specific, careful attention of a predator, recognizing, for the first time in this entire multiverse, something that might actually deserve it. "You feed on life itself," Alucard said slowly. "Not blood, not flesh, the essence beneath it. Yes, I feed on blood, on terror, on the specific moment a living thing understands, completely, that it is about to die." Alucard's smile returned, slow, sharp, genuinely delighted. "We are not the same creature, sorcerer. But I begin to suspect we are cousins." "Then let us test," Moro said. "Which of us the multiverse fears more?" The barrier, already weakened past any margin Frieza had accounted for, did not merely crack under the combined pressure of Alucard's presence and Moro's sudden focused will. It shattered. The alarm that tore through the Galactic Patrol's monitoring network reached the Null Realm within minutes. Jacko, the small, excitable Galactic Patrolman attached to Earth's defense detail, relaying the report to Bulma with visibly shaking hands before it was escalated, with considerably more urgency, all the way up to Beerus's own observation deck. "He's out." Jacko's voice crackled through the emergency channel, thin with panic. "Moro's out of containment, the seal's completely gone, there's no trace of the barrier at all, and there's some kind of second signature with him, something the patrol's instruments can't even properly register." Beerus's tail had gone rigid the instant the report reached him, the specific, cold dread of a god who had just watched a carefully managed situation spiral entirely outside his control. "Whis, where is Frieza?" Whis's expression, for the first time since the newcomers had arrived, carried genuine, unmasked alarm. "Not on the observation deck, Lord Beerus. I haven't seen him in several hours." "And the coated one?" "Also absent." Beerus closed his eyes for a long, furious moment, every piece of the last several days rearranging itself into a shape he should have seen coming. "That miserable, scheming," he bit off the rest of the sentence, already moving toward the deck's edge, aura flaring to life around him in preparation for a speed he rarely bothered using. "Get Goku. Get Vegeta. Get every fighter in this tournament capable of standing near Moro without dying instantly. And get them moving now. Whis, where's the bald one?" Saitama, as it happened, had already heard the commotion, the particular, unmistakable quality of alarm rippling through the Null Realm's chain of command was not the kind of thing even his usual boredom could ignore, and was, when Whis located him moments later, already standing, noodle cup abandoned, expression flat and focused in a way it hadn't been since his own exhibition match. "Your friends caused a problem," Whis said, without preamble. "Yeah, figured." Saitama's jaw tightened, the closest thing to genuine worry his face had shown since arriving in this strange, bright cosmos. Told him to be careful. Guess that's not really his thing. He fell into step beside Whis, already moving toward the deck's edge. "Where is he?" A place called the Galactic Prison. I'm told it currently houses one of this multiverse's most dangerous prisoners. A being who devours entire planets' worth of life. And now, apparently, your companion as well. Saitama's expression flattened further. Something grim and decided settling into the set of his shoulders. Great, he muttered. Guess I'm finding out what a planet eater tastes like today. The scene that greeted Beerus's rapidly assembled response team upon arrival at the Galactic Prison's shattered lower levels was not the carnage any of them had braced for. It was, instead, something considerably stranger. A vast, cavernous holding chamber, walls scorched and cracked from whatever containment failure had occurred. And at its center, Moro, vast, ancient, his robed form crackling faintly with the stolen magic of 100 consumed worlds, locked in a standstill with Alucard that neither party seemed remotely inclined to end. Frieza stood off to one side, notably unharmed, watching the confrontation with the fixed, calculating stillness of a man whose careful plan had gone somewhat sideways, and who was now, with visible effort, trying to determine whether the deviation still worked in his favor. "You're slower than I expected," Moro was saying, robes billowing with barely restrained hunger, one hand extended toward Alucard in a gesture that should have, by every account the Galactic Patrol had on file, begun siphoning the life directly from his target's body. "I've drained gods with less effort than this. Why won't you empty?" "Because," Alucard said, entirely unbothered by the drain visibly failing to take hold, shadows pooling and writhing at his shoulders in slow, hungry motion. "I am not, strictly speaking, alive in the sense your gift requires. I died a very long time ago, sorcerer. What's left of me runs on considerably stranger fuel than the life you're so accustomed to harvesting." Moro's expression, insofar as a being with so little remaining of an original face could manage one, twisted into something between fascination and genuine, dawning alarm. "Undead," he said slowly. "I have consumed undead before. Lesser things. Shambling husks with borrowed animation. I am not a lesser thing." Alucard's smile widened, teeth sharpening visibly in the chamber's dim light, the shadows around him coalescing further into shapes that Beerus, watching from the chamber's entrance, recognized with a fresh, cold jolt of alarm as eyes, dozens of them, blinking open across the mass of writhing dark. "I am considerably older than most of what you've eaten, and I have spent centuries being considerably harder to finish than anything deserves to be. Shall we test whether that holds true against you specifically? I confess I'm rather looking forward to finding out." He didn't wait for an answer. What followed, according to every witness later debriefed on the incident, did not resemble any battle format the multiverse's fighters had prior experience cataloging. There was no exchange of ki blasts, no clash of auras visible to Beerus's trained eye. Instead, the confrontation played out almost entirely in the register of hunger, two beings whose power fundamentally revolved around consuming something essential from their opponents, locked in a contest neither had ever previously lost. Moro's magic lashed out in waves, each one designed to strip away life essence at a fundamental level, and each one, upon striking Alucard, simply slid off, finding no true life to consume, no essential spark that recognized the drain as a threat worth responding to. Alucard's counter, when it came, was worse. Shadow poured from him in a rolling, hungry mass, dozens of half-formed mouths and staring eyes surging toward Moro not to strike him, but to taste. An assault built not on force, but on the specific, patient horror of something ancient and predatory, recognizing, in Moro, a genuine meal for the first time in centuries. Moro screamed, an ancient, guttural sound that shook the chamber's already damaged walls, as the shadow mass closed around him, not consuming outright, but testing, searching for the specific vulnerability that every living thing, no matter how vast or ancient, ultimately carried somewhere within itself. He's not fighting to kill him, Vegeta said, arriving at the chamber's entrance a half-step behind Goku, both of them taking in the scene with matching expressions of grim, wary calculation. He's fighting to feed. That's... Vegeta's jaw tightened. That's considerably worse. Yeah, Goku agreed, already gathering his ki, gold light beginning to flicker at the edges of his hair. We gotta stop this before one of them actually manages it. It was Beerus, however, who moved first. Not toward Alucard, but toward Frieza, seizing the smaller emperor by the collar with a grip that carried none of his usual restraint. You, Beerus said, voice low and dangerous in a way that made even Frieza's carefully cultivated composure falter, are going to explain, in extremely precise detail, exactly what you thought you were accomplishing here. I thought, Frieza said, with the specific, strained calm of a man choosing his words very carefully, while dangling several inches off the ground, that I was arranging an interesting introduction between two powerful beings, and gathering useful data on the results. I did not anticipate the seal being quite so structurally compromised. That detail was, admittedly, outside my calculations. You didn't check. I checked what I could access. The patrol's most recent structural reports were, apparently, not among them. Frieza's eyes flicked, briefly, toward the ongoing confrontation, something in his expression sharpening, despite the danger of his current position. Regardless of the oversight, Lord Beerus, I'd suggest your energy is better spent stopping that rather than interrogating me. We can discuss my culpability at considerably greater length once the Planet Eater and the vampire have finished deciding which of them gets to consume the other. Saitama arrived not through any of the Galactic Patrol's official channels, but by the simple, direct expedient of asking Whis to point him in the right direction, and then walking there himself, at a pace that covered impossible distances with the same unhurried, mildly put-upon energy he brought to everything else. He stepped into the chamber just as Moro's scream reached its peak, the shadow mass around him tightening, and took in the scene. Beerus dangling Frieza by the collar, Goku and Vegeta braced and gathering power, the writhing dark consuming half the room, with the flat, weary expression of a man who had, very specifically, warned someone about exactly this outcome less than a week ago. Alucard, he said, voice carrying easily across the chamber, despite its total lack of volume. That's enough. The shadows didn't stop immediately, but something in them hesitated. A fractional pause, the massive eyes and mouths turning, as one, toward the sound of Saitama's voice, and Alucard's own attention following a half-second later, red eyes finding the bald man standing calm and unbothered in the chamber's entrance. Bald one, Alucard said, and something in his voice, still hungry, still sharp, but threaded now with the specific, reluctant fondness he'd developed over their short time together, carried real recognition. I did warn you I intended to find something worth the trouble. Yeah, and I told you to be careful. This ain't careful. This is you eating a guy in front of like 40 witnesses and half a multiverse's worth of gods. He's rather more than a guy. He's consumed entire civilizations. Don't care. Not the point. Saitama walked further into the chamber, entirely unbothered by Moro's continued agonized writhing within the shadow's grip, entirely unbothered by the assembled gods and Saiyans watching him, with matching expressions of wary disbelief. You wanted something that scared you, something that made losing feel real again. I get that, I do. But this ain't that. This is just you finding the biggest thing in the room and deciding it owes you something. That's not fear. That's just, he searched for the word, settling on one with more weight than his flat delivery suggested. That's just being hungry, and calling it meaning. I know the difference. Trust me. I spent a long time not knowing it myself. The chamber went very still. Moro, still held fast in the loosening grip of Alucard's shadow, managed, through visible effort, to focus what remained of his attention on the strange, unassuming man who had just, apparently, talked his opponent into second-guessing an assault that had been on the verge of ending him. "You," Moro rasped, "are the other one. The one whose power the barrier could not measure." "Yeah, that's me." Saitama didn't look at him, kept his focus entirely on Alucard, on the slow, gradual retraction of shadow beginning, at last, to happen. "You gonna finish this? Or you gonna actually think about what you're doing for a second?" Alucard held the moment for a long beat, hunger and reason warring visibly behind eyes that had, for the first time since arriving in this multiverse, found something to actually want. And then, slowly, the shadows withdrew, pooling back into the familiar shape of his coat, Moro collapsing to the chamber floor, weakened, drained at the edges but, critically, undeniably, still alive. "You're no fun," Alucard said, though the words carried none of their usual bite. "Yeah, well, somebody's gotta be the boring one." Saitama finally allowed himself something close to a smile. Small, tired, genuine. "Come on, let's go before the cat god decides to actually erase somebody today." Jiren found Saitama alone the following cycle, seated on the same overturned supply crate, working through what appeared to be his third cup of instant noodles, entirely unbothered by the presence of a being whose meditative stillness had, until this point, unsettled nearly everyone who'd tried to approach him uninvited. "You're the strong one from Universe 11, Saitama said, not looking up from his noodles. "Everybody keeps mentioning you like you're some kind of final boss." "That is how I am generally regarded, yes." Jiren remained standing several paces off, hands loosely at his sides, the specific, deliberate stillness of a man who had trained his entire body to waste no motion it didn't intend. "I did not come to test you." "Good, 'cause I'm eaten. I came to ask a question." Saitama gestured with his chopsticks, an invitation. "Shoot." You stopped your companion mid-feed, with a single word, when neither a god of destruction's presence, nor a sorcerer's own resistance could manage it. Jiren's dark eyes carried none of the usual searching intensity he brought to combat. This was something quieter, more genuinely uncertain than Saitama suspected the man allowed himself to feel very often. "I have spent my entire life training to become strong enough that nothing could threaten what I care about ever again. I built that strength alone, in silence, after losing everything a lesser man would have called a reason to stop trying. I do not understand how a single sentence, spoken by someone who claims no power at all, accomplished something my own strength has never once been asked to do." Saitama set down his noodles, considering the question with more care than he'd expected to need. "It's not about power," he said finally. "Not really." He stopped, "'cause he cared what I thought. That's it. That's the whole trick. Doesn't matter how strong you are if there's nobody around whose opinion actually costs you something to ignore. And if there is no one, then yeah, nothing stops you. That's kind of the problem, right? You said it yourself. You got strong so nothing could threaten what you care about. But somewhere in there, did you leave room for anybody to actually get close enough to matter? Or'd you build all that strength in a room by yourself, with the door locked, so nothing could get in, including the stuff you were trying to protect in the first place?" Jiren didn't answer immediately. The question sat with him longer than most things did, turning over against a foundation he'd built with such total, disciplined care that he'd rarely had reason to examine its cracks. "I lost everyone," he said finally, quiet, the admission costing him something visible even in his carefully controlled posture. "My master, my comrades, everyone who ever mattered to me, taken by a power I could not stop in time. I decided after that strength alone would be sufficient, that I would never again need anyone else's opinion to matter, because I would simply become strong enough that loss could no longer touch me. And has it? Another long silence. No, Jiren admitted, and something in the single syllable carried more weight than his entire prior speech. It has simply meant I face every threat alone. Strength did not remove the possibility of loss. It only removed the people who might have stood beside me while I faced it. Saitama nodded slowly, picking his noodles back up, but his expression had settled into something quieter, more genuinely present than his usual bored deflection. Yeah, I get that. I got stupidly strong chasing something too, and by the time I got there wasn't anybody left who could really share it with me. Everybody kept their distance. Made everything feel, I don't know, hollow kinda. Even winning. He glanced up, meeting Jiren's eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. Alucard's got something you don't, man. Even with all that power you're carrying around. He's got somebody dumb enough to actually tell him no, and he cares enough to listen. That's not weakness. That's the whole thing you're missing. The conversation lingered with Jiren long after it ended. Longer, in fact, than any battle he'd fought in this tournament. Longer than any training regimen he'd endured in the silent, solitary years since Universe 11's darkest hour had claimed everyone he'd once called family. He returned to his own quarters that evening and did something he had not done in longer than he could accurately recall. He sought out Toppo, deliberately, not to discuss strategy or the tournament's shifting political landscape, but simply to sit with him in a silence that, for the first time in years, didn't feel entirely self-imposed. Toppo, sensing something had shifted without fully understanding what, didn't push for explanation. He simply sat and let the silence be shared rather than solitary, and something in Jiren's rigid, careful posture loosened, fractionally, for the first time since his master's death. Alucard, meanwhile, had found his own reckoning taking a stranger shape than he'd expected. Whis sought him out 2 cycles later, not to test him, not on Beerus's orders, but on what he described, with characteristic understatement, as a matter of personal curiosity that had been building since the galactic prison incident. You said something to Moro's warden before you left, Whis said, finding Alucard in quiet contemplation near the arena's edge, that you were not, strictly speaking, alive. I find myself curious what you meant by it, precisely, and whether it connects to Hakai's inability to reach you. Alucard studied him for a long moment, weighing whether the angel's curiosity carried the same clinical distance Vados's had, or something genuinely different. He decided, after a moment, that it did. I died some centuries ago, he said, in a war fought for a cause I no longer remember caring much about. What returned afterward was not resurrection, precisely. It was something closer to a refusal. I simply declined to accept the ending my death was supposed to be, and something in the refusal itself kept me standing. Your Hakai speaks a proposal to its targets. Cease. I have already once said no to that exact proposal, in the most literal sense available to a living thing. I find I no longer know how to hear it as a genuine offer. Whis considered this with real, unhurried care. The specific attention of a being turning over a genuinely novel piece of cosmology, testing it against everything he already understood about the architecture of existence. That is a remarkable thing to have accomplished. Most beings who die stay dead, regardless of how fiercely they might wish otherwise. What made your refusal different? I don't fully know, Alucard admitted, and something in the admission, the willingness to sit in genuine uncertainty rather than retreat into theatrical confidence, surprised even him. I've had centuries to wonder, and I've never found an answer that satisfied me. Perhaps it was simply will. Perhaps something older and hungrier than me found use in keeping me standing. I stopped needing the answer, somewhere along the way, and started simply living with the fact of it instead. A pragmatic approach to an unanswerable question. Whis's smile was, for once, entirely without its usual careful neutrality, something closer to genuine, respectful interest. I confess, in all my centuries attending Lord Beerus, I've rarely encountered a form of existence I couldn't eventually categorize. I find I rather enjoy not being able to, in your case. It keeps things interesting. That, Alucard said, makes precisely two of us. Above them both, unseen, the crack in the null space floor from Saitama's very first half-hearted demonstration had continued its slow, patient widening. No longer a hairline fracture, but a visible seam now, faintly luminous at its edges, running deeper into the fabric of the null realm than anyone had yet bothered to investigate. It would be the Grand Priest, 3 cycles later, conducting a routine structural assessment of the tournament's containment fields, who finally noticed how far the damage had spread, and who would be the first to voice, quietly, to Zen-Oh himself, a concern considerably more pressing than anything either newcomer's individual power had yet posed. "Your Majesty," he said, standing before both versions of the Omni-King with the careful, measured gravity he reserved for matters of genuine consequence, "I believe the Null Realm's foundational structure may not be able to safely contain a tournament with these 2 participants in it. Not because of malice, simply because of what they are. I would recommend, before the tournament of power proceeds any further, that we consider very carefully what happens if that crack finishes what it started." The Grand Priest's warning did not, initially, land with the weight he'd intended. "A crack," Beerus repeated, arms folded, tail flicking with the particular impatience of a god who had already spent the better part of a week fielding crises he hadn't asked for. "In the floor. You want me to interrupt an entire tournament schedule over a crack in the floor? I want you to understand," the Grand Priest said, with the calm, unhurried patience that had weathered considerably worse tempers than Beerus's own, "that the Null Realm is not, strictly speaking, a floor. It is a construct, space carved into temporary existence by Zen-Oh's own authority, held together by a framework never designed to withstand a being capable of folding reality with a single unthrown punch. That crack has not stabilized since it first appeared. It has widened, cycle after cycle, and my instruments now suggest it runs considerably deeper than the visible surface fracture indicates. If it continues unchecked, I cannot guarantee the Null Realm remains a safe container for a tournament whose stakes already include the erasure of entire universes." That, finally, landed. Beerus's tail went still. "You're saying the arena itself might fail. I am saying I do not yet know its limits, and I have not previously needed to ask that question about anything Zen-Oh's authority has built. That, in itself, concerns me considerably more than either newcomer's individual power." The council convened within the hour was larger than any that had preceded it. Every god of destruction present in the tournament, every attendant angel, the Grand Priest himself, and, at Zen-Oh's specific insistence, both newcomers, summoned to answer for a problem neither of them had realized they'd caused. "You want us to what?" Saitama said, once the situation had been explained to him in terms considerably more urgent than the Grand Priest's initial report to Beerus had carried. "Fix a crack? I didn't even hit it that hard. I was being careful." "Careful by your own account was sufficient to fracture a construct built to withstand a tournament designed to threaten the erasure of universes," the Grand Priest said, without accusation, simply stating the scale of the problem plainly. "I do not say this to assign blame. I say it because it establishes something important. Your baseline, even restrained, exceeds what this reality's existing architecture was designed to absorb. That is not a small thing to account for going forward." Alucard, standing beside Saitama with his usual unhurried composure, tilted his head slightly. "And if it cannot be repaired? Then the tournament of power, as currently structured, cannot safely proceed. Zen-Oh would need to either construct an entirely new containment, a process that has, historically, taken considerably longer than the timeline currently allotted, or reconsider whether continuing the tournament at all is worth the structural risk you both now represent, intentionally or not. The chamber went quiet at that, the full weight of the implications settling in. 12 universes worth of stakes, an entire multiverse's political and existential balance, hanging now on a crack neither newcomer had meant to cause. It was Champa, notably, who broke the silence first, not out of concern for the tournament's stakes, which affected his own universe as much as anyone's, but out of the particular, self-interested calculation that had defined most of his contributions to the crisis so far. "So cancel it," he said, shrugging. "Simplest solution. No tournament, no erasure, nobody's universe on the chopping block. I don't see the problem." "The problem," Vados said, dry as ever, "is that Zen-Oh has already invested considerable interest, and no small amount of his own authority, in seeing this tournament through. Canceling it outright is not, I suspect, an option he'll readily accept. And there remains the matter of whatever originally motivated this tournament's stakes in the first place. Erasure isn't a threat Zen-Oh conjured for entertainment alone. Multiple universes were, by his own judgment, contributing insufficiently to the balance of the cosmos. That underlying problem doesn't resolve itself simply because the venue's floor is compromised. Present Zen-Oh, who had been listening to the entire exchange with his usual bright, untroubled attention, finally spoke, and the chamber fell into its customary immediate silence. "I don't want to cancel it," he said simply. "I like this tournament. It's the most interesting one yet." Future Zen-Oh nodded in emphatic agreement. "Me too, Grand Priest. Can't we just fix the floor? We can attempt it, Your Majesty. But I would be doing you a disservice if I did not note. Repairing a construct of this scale, under active strain, while the source of that strain remains present within it, carries genuine risk. I would recommend, at minimum, that both newcomers refrain from any further demonstration of force until repairs are complete." "Fine by me," Saitama said immediately. "Wasn't trying to break your floor in the first place." Alucard, for his part, inclined his head in agreement, though something in his expression suggested a private amusement at the sheer scale of consequence a single, half-hearted punch had managed to produce. It was in the margins of this crisis, while the Grand Priest and a small army of angels worked to assess and begin repairing the Null Realm's compromised foundation, that a considerably quieter, more dangerous conversation was taking place, far from the tournament's central chambers, in the shadowed edges of Universe 9's contingent quarters. Universe 9's roster had never been popular among the tournament's other participants, a collection of scavengers, thieves, and opportunists whose approach to combat leaned heavily on numbers, dirty tactics, and the specific, ruthless pragmatism of fighters who had never once had the luxury of fighting fair. Their leader, a broad-shouldered brute named Bergamo, the Crusher, as his teammates called him, whose strength fed on the fear of those around him, had watched the entire crisis with the same predatory patience he brought to everything. "You heard the report," he said, to his siblings Basil and Lavender, gathered in the quarter's dim light. "The floor's cracking. The whole arena's structural integrity is in question. And everybody up top is so busy panicking about that, they're not watching the two things that caused it near as close as they were a few cycles ago." "You're thinking about the bald one," Basil said, understanding immediately. "I'm thinking about opportunity." Bergamo's grin was slow, ugly, calculating. Man breaks reality with a love tap. Man's companion nearly ate a planet-eater alive, and nobody up top's figured out how to actually use either of them yet. They're too busy being scared or fascinated. Frieza tried and got caught, but Frieza's an idiot who tips his hand. We're not. Lavender, quieter than her brothers, arms folded, studied the plan with visible skepticism. "Use them how, exactly? You saw what happened to Frieza. Guy nearly got a Kai-class threat loose. "We're not gonna free anybody," Bergamo said. "We're gonna do something smarter." That bald guy said it himself. He only fights if there's a reason. So we're gonna give him one. Something personal enough he can't just shrug it off. His grin widened, cold and patient. Universe 9's been on the erasure chopping block since this tournament started. We got nothing to lose and everything to gain if we can get something that strong fighting for us, instead of just standing around being bored. Doesn't matter how we get there. Only matters that we do. Neither Basil nor Lavender voiced objection. In Universe 9's harsh calculus, a universe whose entire roster understood, with total clarity, that losing meant total, permanent erasure. The question of whether a plan was right had long since stopped mattering nearly as much as whether it worked. The Grand Priest's repairs, meanwhile, proceeded with the careful, painstaking precision of a being who had never before needed to mend a construct built by Zen-Oh's own authority. Whis assisted, alongside Vados, and, at Beerus's grudging insistence, a genuinely apologetic Frieza, whose technical expertise in matters of energy manipulation proved, however reluctantly acknowledged, useful in stabilizing the fracture's spreading edges. "You're being unusually cooperative," Whis observed, watching Frieza work with careful, precise control over the containment field's failing seams. "I have a vested interest in this tournament continuing," Frieza said, without looking up. "And I confess, watching the consequences of my own scheme nearly unravel an entire arena has been humbling, in a way I don't often permit myself to experience. I'd prefer not to repeat the lesson. How refreshingly honest for you. Don't grow accustomed to it." By the fracture's edge, working in careful, focused silence, Whis allowed himself a brief, private moment of reflection, turning over everything the past several cycles had revealed. A being whose restraint alone kept an entire multiverse from learning what happened when he stopped holding back. A being whose immortality had, for the first time in centuries, found something worth caring enough about to stop mid-feed. A structural fracture threatening to undo an entire tournament. And, somewhere in the tournament's shadowed margins, though Whis did not yet know it, a plan already forming that would test, more directly than anything Frieza had attempted, exactly how far Saitama's stated principle of only fighting for a reason could be pushed before it broke. He did not yet know what shape that test would take, but something in the careful, deliberate quiet of Universe 9's quarters, when his awareness brushed past them during a routine structural sweep, left him with the same instinctive unease he'd felt the very first night the two newcomers had fallen into this multiverse. Something is still forming, he thought, returning his attention to the fracture's slow, careful repair, and I suspect we have not yet seen its worst version. The repairs to the Null Realm's foundation took the better part of 5 cycles, and it was during the 4th of those cycles, while the Grand Priest's attention remained fixed on stabilizing the deepest fractures, while Whis and Vados split their focus between the structural crisis and their ongoing, careful monitoring of the two newcomers, that Bergamo's plan finally moved from patient observation into action. It began, deceptively, with kindness. Basil found Saitama alone near the arena's rebuilt edge, engaged in his now customary ritual of testing the catering staff's rotating stock for anything resembling decent food, and struck up a conversation with the easy, practiced warmth of someone who had spent a career learning exactly how to make strangers comfortable before exploiting that comfort. "You're the one who cracked the whole arena," Basil said, settling nearby with a friendliness that read, to anyone not actively suspicious, as entirely genuine. "Impressive. Most of us in this tournament would kill for that kind of power. Must be nice, not having to worry about any of this." "Wouldn't call it nice," Saitama said, not looking up from his noodles. "Mostly just boring." "Yeah? See? That's what gets me." Basil leaned back, affecting the loose, casual posture of a man simply passing time. You got all that power and nothing at stake. Meanwhile, my whole universe, everybody I've ever known, is sitting on the edge of getting wiped out completely if we lose this thing. Erased, not dead, erased. Like we never existed at all. You ever think about that? What it'd be like knowing everybody you love could just stop being on some cosmic scorecard you never got a real say in. Saitama's chewing slowed, something in the deliberately casual phrasing catching at an old familiar nerve he hadn't expected anyone in this multiverse to find so precisely. Yeah, he said finally, quieter than usual. I think about that kind of stuff. Then maybe you get why some of us are getting desperate. Basil's expression shifted, carefully, into something that read as genuine vulnerability, a performance honed over years of exactly this kind of manipulation. Universe 9's not exactly beloved round here. Nobody's rushing to save us if we go down. We're the ones everybody already expects to lose. And I keep thinking, what if there was somebody strong enough to actually change that? Somebody who finally had a reason to care whether we made it. It was clumsy, in retrospect. Clumsy enough that Weiss, reviewing the encounter later from recorded observation logs, would flag it immediately as textbook manipulation, the kind of appeal built entirely around Saitama's own stated principle, weaponized with just enough genuine desperation mixed in to make it land. But Saitama, for all his boredom, for all his hard-won cynicism about power and meaning, had a blind spot precisely where Bergamo's siblings had aimed, the specific, old ache of having been powerful and unable to make that power matter to anyone. I'm not saying you gotta do anything, Basil added, carefully, watching the words settle. Just think about it. That's all I'm asking. The second approach came from Lavender, considerably more subtle, aimed not at Saitama but at Alucard, and built around a different lever entirely. She found him during one of his long, quiet evenings watching the distant lights of the 12 universes, and rather than appealing to sympathy, she appealed to something she'd correctly identified as his deeper hunger. You fought Moro, and walked away without finishing it, she said, without preamble, settling nearby with none of Basil's performed warmth, just a flat, direct honesty that Alucard, notably, found considerably more compelling. Everybody's been talking about it like it proves you've got restraint. I don't think that's what it proves. Oh? I think it proves you're still looking for something worth not stopping for. Lavender's eyes were steady, unflinching, carrying none of her brother's manufactured desperation. Universe 9's about to be erased. Actually, permanently erased. If we lose this tournament, not death, not an ending you could talk your way out of or negotiate with. Total unmaking. I've been sitting with that for longer than I'd like, and I gotta tell you, it's the first genuinely final thing I've ever had to actually face. No coming back from it. No century of finding a way to refuse it, the way you did once. Just gone. Alucard turned to study her properly for the first time, something in her flat, unadorned honesty catching at him, in a way Basil's performance hadn't managed with Saitama. You're not asking me for help, he observed. No. I'm just telling you what it's like, facing something actually final. Since you said you've been missing that feeling. Lavender shrugged, standing, already turning to leave. Do with that whatever you want. I'm not gonna beg. Just figured you'd want to know there's a whole universe about to feel exactly what you said you couldn't remember feeling anymore. She left without waiting for a response, and Alucard remained at the railing long after she'd gone, turning the conversation over with considerably more genuine unease than he'd shown since arriving in this strange, bright cosmos. Weiss caught the pattern 2 cycles later, cross-referencing his observation logs with a growing, uncomfortable suspicion, and brought the concern directly to Beerus with none of his usual measured calm. Universe 9, he said. Bergamo's siblings have approached both newcomers separately, over the last several cycles, with carefully tailored appeals. Sympathy for the bald one, an appeal to genuine stakes for the coded one. I don't believe either conversation was accidental. Beerus's tail lashed sharply. Another scheme. Wonderful. Is there a rule against everyone in this tournament trying to weaponize the two beings we can't control? I would recommend one, if it weren't already too late to enforce it retroactively. Wistz's expression carried genuine concern now, the theater of his usual dry humor entirely absent. Lord Beerus, I don't believe Bergamo's approach carries the same recklessness Frieza's did. Frieza wanted data. Bergamo wants an ally, someone whose power could plausibly save Universe 9 from erasure, regardless of the tournament's actual outcome. If either newcomer decides that cause is worth fighting for, then we've got a being capable of folding reality, and a being immune to Hakai actively working to undermine the tournament's entire structure of consequence. Beerus finished the thought grimly. That's not a scheme. That's an existential problem. I don't believe either newcomer intends malice, Whis said. I believe they're being offered, quite deliberately, the exact thing they've both said they're missing. A reason to care, dressed up carefully enough to look genuine. And I don't know that it isn't, at least partially. Universe 9's stakes are real, regardless of Bergamo's motives in exploiting them. Beerus was quiet for a long moment, weighing the problem with visible, mounting frustration. So what do you suggest? We can't forbid them from caring about something. That's rather the opposite of what we've spent this entire ordeal hoping they'd find. No, Whis agreed. I don't think we can, or should, prevent that. I think, instead, we need to ensure that whatever reason they ultimately choose to fight for is one they've arrived at honestly, not one engineered by a desperate universe's calculated manipulation. I would suggest, Lord Beerus, that it's time someone finally told them the full truth about what this tournament actually is, and what it will actually cost, regardless of who wins. Every universe, not just Universe 9's carefully chosen sob story. If they're going to choose a side, let them choose it with the whole picture, not half of one dressed up to look complete. The conversation that followed, Beerus and Whis, joined eventually by Goku, Vegeta, and, at her own quiet insistence, Vados. With both newcomers together for the first time since the Galactic Prison incident, was longer and more honest than anything the tournament had offered either of them since their arrival. They were told, in full, the true scope of the 12 universes, the specific histories of each one's roster, the fact that Universe 9's desperation, while genuine, was one desperate story among a dozen equally desperate ones, each competing for the same finite outcome. They were told about Universe 6, about Universe 2's fashion-obsessed but no less mortal fighters, about the quiet, dignified stakes carried by every universe's weakest, most vulnerable participants. Not just Bergamo's carefully chosen appeal, but the full, complicated, morally exhausting truth of a tournament that would, regardless of anyone's individual heroism, end with several universes gone forever. Saitama listened to all of it in a silence considerably more attentive than his usual demeanor suggested he was capable of. So there's no version of this where everybody wins, he said finally, once the full briefing had ended. No, Beerus confirmed. There isn't. That's rather the entire brutal point of the exercise. Saitama was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, something in his voice carried more weight than it had at any point since arriving in this strange bright cosmos. Then I guess, he said slowly, I gotta actually think about what I want to do with the reason I've been looking for. 'Cause picking one side just means picking who I'm okay with losing. And I really don't think I'm okay with any of that. Beside him, Alucard said nothing at all, but something in his expression, turned toward the distant lights of the 12 universes, suggested he was, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely wrestling with a question that had no clean, satisfying answer. The days that followed carried a different weight than any that had preceded them. Not the frantic, reactive crisis management of the galactic prison incident. Not the careful, clinical testing of the tournament's earliest cycles, but something quieter and considerably harder to resolve. Two beings who had spent centuries and lifetimes respectively, without a reason large enough to matter, now facing an entire multiverse's worth of reasons, none of them clean, all of them costing something regardless of which was chosen. Saitama spent the better part of 2 cycles simply walking through the reconstructed sections of the Null Realm, past the quarters of universes he'd never bothered learning the names of before Beerus's honest briefing, watching, really watching for the first time, the small, unremarkable details of lives that had nothing to do with power levels at all. A Universe 2 fighter braiding a teammate's hair before a training session. A group of Universe 6 competitors sharing a meal in tense, nervous silence, none of them speaking about the erasure clause hanging over all their heads because speaking about it made it too real to bear. A young Namekian from Universe 4's roster, alone, meditating with the specific, focused desperation of someone trying to convince himself he was ready for something he clearly wasn't. He found Basil again on the 3rd day, and this time, he was the one who initiated the conversation. "You lied to me," Saitama said, without preamble, settling across from him with an expression that had lost none of its usual flatness but carried, underneath it, something considerably sharper than before. "Not about Universe 9 being on the chopping block. That part's true, but you made it sound like you were the only ones. Like everybody else's stakes didn't matter as much as yours." Basil, to his credit, didn't bother denying it. "Would you have listened if I hadn't? Maybe. Maybe not. Doesn't really matter now." Saitama shrugged, though the gesture carried less of its usual boredom than before. "Point is, I get it. I get why you did it. Your whole universe is staring down being erased, and you found something strong enough that it might actually change that, so you took your shot. Can't really blame a guy for trying to save everybody he cares about. That's not a villain thing. That's just being scared and doing something about it, instead of just waiting to lose. But you're not gonna help us." "Didn't say that either." Saitama's expression settled into something more genuinely considered than Basil had yet seen from him. "Just said I'm not gonna do it 'cause you tricked me into feeling sorry for you. If I end up doing anything in this tournament, it's gonna be 'cause I actually decided it, not 'cause somebody found the right sob story to push the right button. That's the whole thing I've been missing, and I'm not gonna waste it on somebody else's manipulation, even if the reason underneath it was real." Basil had no response for that, and something in Saitama's calm, unhurried clarity left him with the specific, uncomfortable realization that his carefully constructed appeal had, in the end, taught the bald man something considerably more valuable than sympathy: the difference between being moved and being used. Alucard's reckoning took a different shape entirely. Quieter, more internal, played out not in conversation but in the long, patient hours he spent simply watching the tournament's assembled fighters prepare for a contest, whose stakes he now understood in their full, brutal totality. He found Jiren during one of these vigils, the two of them settling into a shared, wordless understanding that had grown, gradually, out of Jiren's own earlier conversation with Saitama. "You've been quiet," Jiren observed, after a long stretch of companionable silence. "I've been thinking. It's a novel experience, thinking about consequences rather than simply enacting my own hunger and calling the aftermath someone else's problem." Alucard's voice carried none of its usual theatrical weight. "I spent centuries believing immortality had cost me the ability to care about anything, enough to fear losing it. I arrived in this multiverse hoping to find something that would prove me wrong, and now that I have, a dozen universes worth of somethings, each one genuinely worth caring about, I find the actual cost of caring is considerably heavier than I remembered it being. That is, I believe, rather the point of caring about anything at all." Jiren's expression, still largely unreadable, carried something almost like understanding. I built my strength to avoid ever feeling that weight again. I have spent years discovering that avoidance was its own kind of cost, simply paid differently. And now? Now I am uncertain what strength is actually for, if not to be shared with something worth protecting. Jiren was quiet for a long moment. I do not have an answer yet. I suspect neither do you. No, Alucard agreed. But I find, for the first time and longer than I can measure, that I would very much like to find one. It was Whis, watching both newcomers' quiet, internal reckonings unfold over the following cycles, who finally brought the matter back to Beerus, with a proposal considerably more careful than anything either of them had yet attempted. I don't believe either of them intends to simply pick a side and fight for it, he said. I believe, if given the choice, they'll want to find a way to matter to this tournament without becoming another lever for someone else's scheme to pull. That's a considerably harder thing to arrange than a straightforward alliance. What do you suggest? I suggest, Whis said slowly, working the idea through as he spoke it aloud, that we ask them directly what they actually want, not what we want from them, not what Frieza or Bergamo's siblings want from them, but what they, themselves, having now seen the tournament's full and honest shape, actually wish to do with the reason they've apparently found. I believe, Lord Beerus, that they've earned the right to answer that question on their own terms, rather than having it answered for them by whoever manipulates them most effectively. Beerus considered this for a long moment, tail flicking with the particular restlessness of a god, forced to accept a solution less controllable than he'd prefer. Fine, he said finally. Ask them. But Whis, whatever they decide, I want it clear that it changes nothing about the tournament's actual structure. Zen-Oh's rules stand regardless of what two outsiders choose to do about them. Understood, Lord Beerus. Though I confess, Whis added, with the faint, private note of someone who suspected the coming conversation would matter considerably more than his god currently anticipated. I suspect their answer may end up changing more than either of us expects. The question, when finally posed to both newcomers together, Whis, careful and direct, asking simply what they wanted to do, now that they understood the tournament's true stakes in full, met with a silence that stretched longer than either Beerus or Whis had anticipated. It was Saitama who answered first, and his answer, when it came, surprised everyone present, including, visibly, himself. I don't want to fight for anybody, he said slowly, working the thought out as he spoke it. Not 'cause I don't care, 'cause every side of this thing has somebody worth caring about, and picking one just means deciding whose worth matters less. I'm not doing that. I've had enough people decide my worth didn't matter much, back home, to know how much that sucks on the receiving end. He looked up, meeting Beerus's eyes directly. But I'm also not just gonna sit here and watch a bunch of universes get erased, 'cause some rule says that's how it's gotta work. So here's what I actually want. I want to know if there's a way to stop the erasure part entirely. Not win the tournament for one side. Stop the whole thing from costing anybody their existence in the first place. The chamber went very still. That, Beerus said finally, very carefully, is not how the tournament of power works. That has never been how it works. Zen-Oh's rule is absolute. Yeah, well, Saitama shrugged, and something in the simple, unhurried gesture carried more weight than any threat he could have made. Maybe it's time somebody actually asked him if it has to stay that way. The request to speak with Zen-Oh directly was not one Beerus granted lightly. No mortal, no god, not even a fellow destroyer, made a habit of requesting an audience to challenge the fundamental premise of a tournament the Omni King himself had designed. But something in Saitama's flat, unbothered certainty, paired with the Grand Priest's own quiet, growing curiosity about what these two beings might actually represent, made the request impossible to simply dismiss. You understand, the Grand Priest said, as he escorted both newcomers toward the throne chamber, Beerus and Whis, trailing behind with matching expressions of tightly controlled apprehension, that Zen-Oh has erased entire universes for considerably smaller provocations than what you're about to propose. His authority is not decoration. It is absolute, in the most literal sense that word can carry. Yeah, I got that, Saitama said. Doesn't mean I shouldn't ask. Worst he says is no. Worst he does, Beerus muttered, is decide you're the provocation, and erase you both on the spot. Can he actually do that? Saitama glanced sideways at Alucard, who offered only a faint, considering shrug in response, clearly having wondered the same thing, and arrived at no more comforting an answer. We're rather hoping not to find out, Whis said. Though I confess, given how thoroughly you've both already upended every prior assumption we held about the limits of erasure, I find myself less certain than I'd like to be. Both versions of Zen-Oh received them with their usual bright, untroubled curiosity. An audience chamber assembled hastily, but with full ceremonial weight, every god of destruction and attendant angel present, drawn by the sheer, unprecedented novelty of what was about to happen. Two outsiders, walking in unbidden, to question the very foundation of the multiverse's oldest and most absolute tournament. You wanted to talk to us, present Zen-Oh said, swinging his legs, delighted. About the erasing part. Yeah, Saitama stepped forward, hands in his pockets, entirely unbothered by the sheer, cosmic weight of the audience he now stood before. I've been here a few weeks now. Watched a lot of people getting ready to lose everything, not 'cause they did anything wrong, just 'cause that's the rule. And I guess I don't really get why it has to be that way. Seems like a lot of suffering for what's basically just a big fight. Future Zen-Oh tilted his head, genuinely considering the question, rather than dismissing it. The universes weren't contributing enough. That's why the tournament exists. It's not cruelty. It's balance. Right, that's what everybody keeps saying. Balance. Saitama's expression stayed flat, but something underneath it had sharpened. The particular directness he brought to conversations that actually mattered to him. But balance for who? You're not fighting. You're not risking anything. You're just watching a bunch of people who are risking everything, and deciding afterward whether they deserve to keep existing. That's not balance. That's just judgment, dressed up as a game. The chamber went utterly, completely silent. Beerus's tail had gone entirely rigid. Several angels present exchanged glances carrying the specific, quiet alarm of beings who had just watched someone say, aloud, in front of Zen-Oh himself, something none of them had ever dared voice even privately. Present, Zen-Oh's expression shifted, not to anger, which none of the beings present had ever actually witnessed, and which none of them wanted to witness now, but to something more genuinely, uncomfortably thoughtful. Nobody's ever said that to us before, he said slowly. Probably 'cause everybody's too scared you'll erase them for it, Saitama said, which, I mean, no offense, kinda proves my point. If the only reason nobody questions something is 'cause they're scared of what happens if they do, that's not really balance either. That's just fear wearing balance's clothes. Alucard, standing beside him, chose that moment to add his own voice, quieter than Saitama's, but carrying the particular weight of someone who had spent centuries thinking about exactly this kind of question. I have watched empires rise on precisely this logic, small king. That destruction, meted out from a position no one can challenge, constitutes order. It rarely does. It merely postpones the reckoning until someone finally arrives who isn't afraid to ask the question you've just been asked. And you're not afraid, future Zen-Oh said, watching them both with genuine, searching curiosity now. No, Saitama said simply, not of you. I've met scarier things than a rule I don't agree with. The silence that followed stretched long enough that several of the assembled gods visibly braced for the worst. For the specific, casual gesture that had, in the multiverse's history, erased entire realities without ceremony or warning. Instead, both Zen-Ohs looked at each other, communicating something in the wordless, immediate way only they seemed able to manage, and present Zen-Oh finally spoke, his tone carrying none of its usual careless delight. Something closer, for the first time any of the assembled beings had witnessed, to genuine reflection. "We made the rule a long time ago," he said, "because we got bored, and because the universes needed a reason to try harder. We never really thought about whether it was fair, just whether it was interesting." "That's kind of the whole problem," Saitama said, gently now, some of his earlier bluntness softening into something closer to patience. "I'm not saying you're a bad guy. I don't think you are. I think you just never had anybody around who'd tell you when something you built stopped making sense. Everybody's too scared. I'm not. So I'm telling you." The Grand Priest, watching the exchange with the careful, unhurried attention of a being who had served Zen-Oh since before most present could remember, finally spoke, his voice measured and deliberate. "Your Majesty, if I may, it is within your authority to amend the tournament stakes, if you judge it worth amending. Nothing requires the erasure clause to remain as it was originally conceived. The tournament's purpose, encouraging the universes to strive, to grow, to prove their worth, could be preserved without total, permanent unmaking as its price." Future Zen-Oh considered this for a long moment, swinging his legs, weighing a decision none of the beings present had ever imagined he'd actually reconsider. "Okay," he said finally, simply, as though the decision cost him nothing at all despite the cosmic scale of what it actually meant. "Let's change it. Losing universes still lose something. I still want it to matter, but not everything. Not erased completely. Grand Priest, figure out something fair." Present Zen-Oh nodded along, delighted by the novelty of the whole exercise. "Yeah, this is way more interesting anyway. Now everybody gets to keep trying next time too." The chamber remained silent for a long beat afterward, the specific, stunned silence of an entire assembled multiverse watching centuries of absolute, unquestioned precedent overturned by a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit who had, 3 weeks earlier, fallen out of the sky looking for cabbage. Beerus, for his part, simply stared, tail hanging entirely limp, an expression of complete, uncharacteristic speechlessness settling over his usually sharp features. "Whis," he said finally, very quietly. "Did that actually just happen?" "It appears so, Lord Beerus." He just talked Zen-Oh into changing the single most fundamental rule of the entire tournament by being rude to him. "I believe," Whis said, with the faint, private note of someone who had suspected, for some time now, that this exact outcome was possible. He simply told him the truth, Lord Beerus. "I don't believe anyone else in this multiverse's entire history has ever actually tried that particular approach." Later, once the chamber had emptied and the full, staggering implications of what had just happened began rippling outward through every universe's roster, word spreading in hours, then minutes, that the erasure clause had been amended, that entire families and civilizations across 12 universes would not, after all, cease to exist simply for losing a fight. Saitama found himself alone on the arena's rebuilt edge, Alucard settling beside him with the same quiet, companionable stillness that had defined most of their strangest moments together. "You did something today," Alucard said, "that I suspect very few beings in the history of this multiverse could have accomplished. Just told the truth. Wasn't that big a deal?" "It was an enormous deal. You simply don't appear capable of experiencing it as one." Alucard's smile carried, for the first time, something entirely unguarded, real, uncomplicated warmth. "I came to this multiverse looking for something worth losing myself over. I believe, bald one, I found something considerably better instead. I found someone worth becoming something over. Saitama glanced sideways at him, something in his own expression softening into a rare, genuine smile. Yeah, well, don't get sappy about it. Come on. He pushed off the railing, already turning toward wherever the reconstructed Null Realm's next surprise was waiting. Tournament still gotta happen. Might as well go watch. Bet it's actually gonna mean something now. The Tournament of Power resumed 3 cycles later, under rules no multiverse had ever fought by before. The erasure clause replaced, at the Grand Priest's careful design and Zen-Oh's genuine approval, with a graduated cost. Losing universes would surrender power, resources, and standing among the 12, a real and painful consequence, but never total unmaking. Every roster that had spent weeks bracing for annihilation now fought instead for something they could actually rebuild from, if they fell short. The shift in the arena's atmosphere was immediate and total. Universe 9's fighters, Bergamo included, entered the reconstructed arena with something none of them had carried in years. Not desperation, but genuine hope. The specific, lighter posture of beings fighting to win, rather than fighting merely to survive. Bergamo found Saitama before the opening bout, and for once, his approach carried no manipulation at all. Didn't expect you to actually go through with it, he admitted. Figured you'd get bored, or decide it wasn't your problem. Almost did, Saitama said honestly. But your sister told your companion something about facing something actually final, and that stuck with him. Kinda stuck with me too, once I thought about it enough. Guess you got what you wanted after all, just not the way you planned it. Yeah. Bergamo's grin, for the first time, carried nothing calculating in it at all. I'll take it. Alucard, for his part, spent the tournament's remaining cycles in a manner that reflected the quiet transformation the past weeks had worked in him. No longer haunting the arena's margins in search of a feeding worth the name, but genuinely present, watching each match unfold with the attentive, engaged interest of someone who had, finally, found a world worth caring about the outcome of. He and Jiren became, in the strange, understated way of 2 solitary beings recognizing kinship, something like friends, sparring occasionally, in careful, controlled exchanges neither treated as anything but mutual respect, and sitting together, more often than not, in the same wordless companionship Jiren had shared with Toppo since his own reckoning began. Goku, characteristically, spent every spare moment he could pestering Saitama for a real rematch. Not a testing one, a real one, and was, characteristically, always politely declined, though Saitama did, eventually, admit that Goku's persistence had become kind of the first fun thing about the whole ordeal. The tournament concluded, weeks later, without a single universe erased. Universe 11 emerging as the eventual victor, Jiren's own quiet transformation, carrying him further than his solitary years ever had. A win that felt, for the first time in the tournament's long history, genuinely earned rather than merely survived. Zen-Oh, delighted with how the whole affair had unfolded, offered both newcomers a choice before the gathering finally dispersed. Remain in this multiverse, welcomed now as something between honored guests and permanent fixtures of its strange, sprawling cosmology, or attempt a return to their own worlds, should such a thing prove possible. Saitama considered it for a long moment, looking out at the reconstructed Null Realm, at Goku, still grinning, already planning their next sparring session, at Bergamo's siblings, laughing with something like real relief for the first time in years, at Jiren and Alucard, sitting together in easy, comfortable silence. Nah, he said finally. I think I'll stick around. Cabbage'll keep. Alucard's answer came without hesitation at all. I came here searching for something worth losing. Instead, I found something worth staying for. I believe I'll remain as well. The multiverse, in the years that followed, would tell this story many times, in many forms. The tale of a bald man who arrived looking for groceries and rewrote the fundamental rule of a tournament as old as the 12 universes themselves, and an immortal creature who came searching for fear and found instead something considerably rarer, a reason to stay. Beerus, ever reluctant to admit when he'd been wrong, would grumble for years afterward about numbed arms and cracked floors, and the sheer indignity of having his entire cosmology upended by a man in a yellow jumpsuit who'd wanted, of all things, cabbage. But even he, on the rare occasions the subject arose, would admit, quietly, and only ever once, that it had been the single most interesting tournament of his very long life. And somewhere in the Null Realm's rebuilt arena, on quiet evenings when the 12 universes' distant lights shone steady and unerased above, two impossible strangers sat together, no longer strangers, no longer merely passing through, simply present, in a multiverse that had, at last, given them both something worth being present for.